Clara Bennett set down her spoon before her father could stop her. The entire table went still. Jonathan Whitmore, the most powerful man in 3 counties, sat at the head of their humble dinner table like he already owned the chairs beneath them. He had just declared calmly and with perfect confidence that the river crossing belonged to him. Clara's hands did not shake. Her voice did not waver. She looked directly into his eyes and said, "Mr. Whitmore, you are mistaken." No one in Shenandoah Valley had ever said those words to him, until tonight. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to our channel and follow every part until the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The summer of 1814 came to Shenandoah Valley the way trouble always did, quiet at first, then all at once. The Bennett farm sat on 12 acres of good Virginia soil, bordered on the eastern edge by the creek their grandfather had named Patience Run. It wasn't a wide creek. It wasn't a famous one. But it fed the lower fields in July when everything else dried up, and it had fed them for 31 years since the first Bennett broke ground on this land and built the crossing himself out of river stones and white oak timber. The crossing was the problem, not the creek, not the land. Just the crossing 20 feet of flat stone and timber that sat precisely at the point where the Bennett property met the outer edge of Whitmore territory. And Jonathan Whitmore had decided sometime in the spring of that year that the crossing belonged to him. He hadn't sent a letter. He hadn't sent a lawyer. He had done something far more unsettling. He had accepted their dinner invitation. Eleanor Bennett had extended it 3 weeks prior, in a moment of hopeful diplomacy. Her husband George had immediately regretted. "You invited him here," George had said, standing in the kitchen with flour on his hands and disbelief on his face. "To this house, to eat at this table." "I invited him to talk," Eleanor said in the tone she used when the matter was already settled. "People talk better when they're fed. People like Jonathan Whitmore don't talk, Ellie, they decide." That was the truth of it. In Rockingham County, Virginia, in the summer of 1814, Jonathan Whitmore didn't negotiate. He didn't petition. He didn't persuade. He arrived, he assessed, and he concluded. And whatever he concluded had a way of becoming county record before the week was out. He owned 4,000 acres of prime Virginia farmland. He had won 2 legal disputes over water rights in the past decade, both of them against families with stronger claims than the Bennetts. He employed 40 men and housed their families on his land. When Jonathan Whitmore spoke at a county assembly, other men took notes. And on a Tuesday evening in late July, with the heat still sitting heavy in the low Virginia hills, and the fireflies just beginning to come out over the south field, his black carriage rolled up the narrow dirt road that led to the Bennett farmhouse. Clara watched it from the kitchen window. She was 24 years old and had lived on this farm her entire life. She knew every stone of it, every stubborn fence post, every muddy boot path between the barn and the house. She had helped her father survey the property lines 3 summers ago, walking the perimeter with a compass and the original land deed her grandfather had filed with the county clerk in 1783. She knew exactly where the Bennett property ended. She knew exactly where the crossing sat in relation to that line. And she knew Jonathan Whitmore was wrong. She had known it since the afternoon 3 weeks ago, when her father came inside with his hat in his hands and told the family what Whitmore's man had said. She had gone to the writing desk in the parlor, pulled out the land deed, pulled out 2 county survey records, and sat with them for the better part of an afternoon. When she was done, she was certain. The crossing had been built on Bennett land. The deed said so. The survey markers said so. 2 different county records from 1797 confirmed the original property line had never been altered. Jonathan Whitmore was wrong. The problem was that being right and being heard were 2 entirely different things in Rockingham County in 1814, especially when you were a farmer's daughter and the man you were correcting was Jonathan Whitmore. Her mother appeared at her shoulder. "Clara." Just the one word. But Eleanor Bennett could say a great deal with very little. "I know," Clara said. "You will be polite." "I am always polite." "You will be quiet." Clara said nothing to that. Her mother studied her profile for a moment. Clara Ann Bennett. I haven't said anything yet, Mama. It's not what you've said. It's the way you're looking at that carriage. Eleanor pressed a hand briefly to her daughter's shoulder. Your father needs this to go smoothly. He needs Whitmore to leave here without a reason to make things worse. Do you understand me? I understand you. Do you agree with me? A pause. I'll be polite. Eleanor closed her eyes for just a moment. Then she turned back to the stove. Sheesh. Jonathan Whitmore was taller than Clara had expected. She didn't know why that surprised her. She had seen him twice before at county gatherings, once at the spring assembly 2 years ago, once at the Methodist Church social the summer before that. But both times from a distance, and both times he had seemed like what he was. A wealthy man among other wealthy men, distinguished mainly by the quality of his coat, and the particular way other men stepped aside to let him pass. Up close, he was something else. He filled the doorway of the Bennett farmhouse in a way that was not entirely about his height. He was lean and dark-haired with the kind of stillness about him that suggested he had never in his adult life needed to fill a room with noise, because the room simply arranged itself around him the moment he entered it. His coat was black. His boots were clean in a way that suggested someone had cleaned them very recently, which in the dust of a Virginia July spoke to a kind of determined presentation. He had dark eyes that moved through the room once quickly, thoroughly, and then settled on George Bennett with the polite but absolute attention of a man who was accustomed to being the most important person in any given space. Mr. Whitmore, George said, extending his hand. Thank you for coming. Mr. Bennett. Whitmore shook it. His voice was low and even with the flat authority of a man who never had to raise it. Mrs. Bennett. He nodded to Eleanor. His gaze moved to the 2 younger Bennett children standing near the parlor door, Thomas 14 and young Ruth 10, and he gave them a brief polite nod as well. Then his eyes found Clara. She had positioned herself near the kitchen doorway with a dish towel in her hands, which she had brought specifically so she would have something to do with her hands. She was not nervous. She was careful. There was a difference. My daughter Clara, George said. Whitmore looked at her for one moment longer than he had looked at anyone else. Then he said, Miss Bennett, and turned his attention back to her father. Clara watched him cross to the parlor. She noticed that he moved through the small, crowded space of the Bennett farmhouse without any visible discomfort, without the particular stiffness some wealthy men showed when they found themselves somewhere beneath their station. He sat when Eleanor indicated the chair at the right of the table. He accepted the glass of water Thomas brought him. He spoke to George about the county road improvements with what sounded like genuine attention. He was, Clara thought, very good at this, at being present in a room on his own terms. She brought out the bread and set it on the table, and he thanked her without looking up from what George was saying, and she returned to the kitchen and thought he is polite in the way powerful men are sometimes polite as a choice, not a habit. As a tool, not a character. That was the thing about Jonathan Whitmore that the county didn't fully understand. People feared him because of his wealth and his land. But the real thing about him, the thing Clara had been turning over since she'd first heard about the crossing dispute, was that he was intelligent. Genuinely, sharply intelligent. And intelligent men who were never challenged had a particular kind of blind spot. They stopped checking whether they were right because they had stopped expecting to be wrong. She carried the stew pot to the table. Dinner began quietly enough. Eleanor's cooking was good. It was always good summer stew with garden vegetables and cornbread that came out golden and hot, and for the first half hour, the conversation stayed in safe territory. The county road. The dry summer. The price of corn at the Harrisonburg market. George was careful and warm, steering clear of the crossing, letting the meal breathe. Jonathan Whitmore ate with the controlled attention he seemed to bring to everything. He complimented the stew in 2 words, very good, and meant them. He answered George's questions with complete sentences and asked 2 questions in return that showed he had actually listened to what George said. He was in the manner of the meal a perfect guest. Clara sat across the table from him between young Ruth and the window and watched. She ate. She passed the cornbread when Thomas asked. She refilled her water glass. And she watched Jonathan Whitmore, and she thought about the land deed in the parlor desk drawer, and she thought about the survey records, and she thought about her father's face when he'd come inside 3 weeks ago with his hat in his hands. She thought about the fact that her father was 61 years old and had worked this land for 30 years, and that the creek crossing was the only practical way to reach the lower east field in wet season, and that without it, the east field was nearly useless, and that the east field produced about a third of their yearly crop yield. She thought about what it would mean if Jonathan Whitmore took the crossing. She thought about her father, who would never say any of this at the dinner table because George Bennett was a gentleman who believed in courtesy and patience and the goodness of people, and who had spent his whole life being right about that, in ways that had kept him from fighting for things he should have fought for. The stew pot made its second round. Thomas asked Whitmore a careful question about the county assembly. Whitmore answered it. George laughed at something. Eleanor poured more water, and then Whitmore set down his spoon in the precise and deliberate way he seemed to do everything and said, "I appreciate the hospitality, Mr. Bennett. I want to be straightforward with you. I believe we can resolve the matter of the eastern crossing simply and fairly, and I'd like to discuss the terms this evening if you're agreeable." George straightened slightly. "Of course. I've had my surveyor review the property boundaries," Whitmore said. He spoke to George directly, calmly, as though the resolution were already determined, and this was simply the communication of it. "The crossing structure sits within 4 feet of the disputed boundary. Given that the original construction used timber drawn from my land, the White Oak Grove on the North Ridge, and given that the primary traffic across the crossing has historically served Whitmore cattle operations rather than Bennett fieldwork, I believe a reasonable assessment places the crossing within my rightful claim. I'm prepared to offer a fair compensation for any inconvenience the reassignment causes." George was quiet for a moment. Eleanor set down her water glass very carefully. Thomas and Ruth sat very still in the way children sit when they understand that something important and possibly frightening is happening. Clara set down her spoon. The table went completely silent. And into that silence Clara said, "Forgive me, Mr. Whitmore, but you are mistaken." The air in the room changed. It didn't get louder. It got denser, the particular density of a moment in which something has been said that cannot be unsaid, and everyone in the room is recalibrating accordingly. George Bennett turned to look at his daughter with an expression that contained in equal measure alarm, love, and resignation. Eleanor's hands went flat on the table. Thomas and Ruth exchanged a glance that communicated volumes without a single word. Jonathan Whitmore turned his head and looked at Clara. He did not look surprised exactly. He looked, and this was something Clara would think about later in the quiet of her room that night, assessed, as though she had just done something that required him to reconsider his initial categorization of her. "Miss Bennett," he said. "The white oak timber," Clara said in a voice that she was pleased to note sounded entirely steady, "was not drawn from your land. The North Ridge Grove sits at the boundary of the old Harlan property, which my grandfather purchased in 1801. It passed to my father upon my grandfather's death and was recorded with the county clerk in March of 1803. The grove has been Bennett property for 11 years. Whitmore said nothing. "Furthermore," Clara continued, "the primary historical use of the crossing has been Bennett fieldwork, not Whitmore cattle. The crossing was constructed in 1783 specifically to allow access to the lower east field during flood season, which your cattle operations did not use until 1809, when your man Hobbs requested and received temporary permission from my father to drive cattle across it during the drought. That permission was given as a courtesy and was never intended as a transfer of right." The silence in the room had a different quality now. George Bennett was looking at his daughter the way a man looks at something he has long known was there, but has only just fully seen. Jonathan Whitmore had not moved. His dark eyes were fixed on Clara with an expression she couldn't read, and she was generally good at reading expressions. "You're familiar with the property records," he said finally. "I read them," Clara said. "The original deed, the 1797 county survey, the transfer record for the Harlan property, the county boundary assessment from 1806. She paused. "I can produce all of them if you'd like to review them this evening." Whitmore's gaze held hers for a long moment. Then he said, "Where are they?" "Clara," George said quietly. "In the parlor desk," she said, already pushing back her chair. "The top left drawer. I'll get them." "Clara," her father's voice was low, careful. "You don't have to." "It's all right, Papa." She went to the parlor. She heard behind her the very particular silence of a dinner table in which no one quite knew where to look. She heard her mother offer more cornbread in a voice that was perhaps slightly more cheerful than the moment strictly required. She heard Thomas say something to Ruth in an undertone. She did not hear Jonathan Whitmore say anything. She found the documents in the drawer where she'd left them neatly folded and placed in the order she'd organized them: deed first, then the 1797 survey, then the Harlan transfer record, then the 1806 boundary assessment. She carried them back to the dining room and set them on the table in front of Jonathan Whitmore. He looked at them for a moment before picking them up. Then he unfolded the deed and read it. He read it carefully. Not quickly, the way a man reads something he's already decided is irrelevant, but carefully, the way a man reads something that is telling him information he needs to account for. He moved through the survey next, then the Harlan transfer, then the boundary assessment. It took 6 minutes. Clara timed it against the clock on the parlor shelf, which she could see from her seat. When he finished, he set the documents down on the table with the same precise, deliberate care with which he'd set down his spoon earlier. He looked at Clara. "The Harlan Grove transfer," he said. "March 1803. Recorded with Rockingham County Clerk James Alderton. My surveyor indicated the grove was undivided Whitmore property. Your surveyor was working from the 1799 county map," Clara said. "The Harlan transfer occurred in 1803. The 1799 map wouldn't reflect it." A pause. "No," Whitmore said. "It wouldn't." George Bennett let out a breath so quiet that only someone paying close attention would have heard it. Eleanor refilled Whitmore's water glass with absolute composure. Whitmore looked at the documents again for a moment. Then he looked at Clara. "You assembled these yourself," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes." "When?" "3 weeks ago, when my father told us what your man had said about the crossing." He studied her with that unreadable expression again. In the lamplight, his face was all clean angles and dark shadows. The face of a man who kept his interior life rigorously to himself. Clara had the distinct impression that she was the only person in the room he was actually looking at. Not just seeing, but looking at in the particular way you look at something you weren't expecting. "You read the land records," he said. "I've read most of the county land records," she said. "My father has copies of many of them. I found them interesting." "You found land records interesting." "Property law is interesting. It determines everything about how people live." She held his gaze. "I reckon that's worth paying attention to." Something shifted in his expression so small and so brief that she almost missed it. It might have been surprise. It might have been something else. "I see," he said. There was a complicated 10 minutes after that. George Bennett found his voice and used it to steer the conversation into slightly calmer waters, suggesting that perhaps the matter deserved a second review by both parties' surveyors in the clear light of day. Whitmore agreed to this with a composure that Clara found remarkable, given that he had in the span of approximately 15 minutes been corrected on the details of his own legal claim by a farmer's daughter at a dinner table. Eleanor brought out the apple cake she'd made that morning and cut generous slices for everyone. Thomas asked Whitmore a question about the new mill on the North Road, and Whitmore answered it, and normal dinner conversation resumed around the surface of things. But it was different now, the way a room is different after a window has been opened in it, even after the window is closed again. Clara ate her apple cake and said nothing more, because she had said what needed to be said, and she was not in the business of pressing an advantage beyond what the moment required. But she was aware, and this was something she hadn't anticipated, that Jonathan Whitmore kept glancing at her. Not staring, Not in any way that could be called rude or inappropriate, just glancing. The way a person glances at something that has surprised them and that they haven't yet finished thinking about. It happened 4 times over the course of the apple cake and the coffee that followed it, and each time Clara either didn't notice which was a lie or didn't react which was the truth. When he stood to leave, he thanked Eleanor for the meal in 2 words that sounded genuine. He shook George's hand. He nodded to Thomas and Ruth. He picked up his hat from the peg by the door, and then he paused, just briefly, just a half second, and he looked at Clara. "Miss Bennet," he said. "Mr. Whitmore." Something moved in his expression. Then he nodded, put on his hat, and walked out into the July night. Clara washed the dinner plates, while her father sat at the kitchen table, and her mother put the younger children to bed. George Bennet was quiet for a long time. He had his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, and he was looking at the middle distance in the way he looked when he was sorting through something complex. Finally he said, "Clara." "Yes, Papa." "You were right about the documents." "I know." Another silence. "You might have waited. Let me handle it first. Let the evening go peacefully, and then—" "Then what?" Clara set a plate on the drying rack and turned to look at him. Her voice was gentle because she loved her father very much, and she knew this was hard for him. "Then he goes back to his estate and files the claim, and we spend 6 months and money we don't have, arguing it before a county judge who's known Jonathan Whitmore since they were boys together at school. I reckon we'd have lost Papa. Not because we were wrong, because we'd have been late." George looked at her. "The documents needed to be seen tonight," she said, "before he left this house believing he was right." She picked up another plate. "He's an honest man, I think, in his own way. He didn't argue with the records. He didn't dismiss them. He looked at them." "He looked at you," George said quietly. Clara kept washing. "He looked at the documents." "Clara Ann." She didn't answer. Her father set down his coffee cup. "You know what you did tonight, daughter. I protected the crossing. You challenged Jonathan Whitmore at his own game in front of his own face at our dinner table." George was quiet for a moment. "He is not a man who forgets." "Good," Clara said. "I'd rather he remember correctly than forget conveniently." George picked up his coffee cup again. He looked into it. Then very quietly, so quiet, she almost didn't hear it over the sound of the dishes. He said, "Your grandfather would have liked you very much." Clara smiled at the plate in her hands. "Betty." Jonathan Whitmore's carriage reached the main road before he told James, his driver, to slow down. James slowed without comment. He had been driving for Whitmore for 11 years and had learned not to require explanations. Whitmore sat in the darkness of the carriage and looked out the window at the Virginia night, the July fields silver black under a half moon, the fireflies still working in the grass along the road's edge, the smell of warm earth and honeysuckle coming through the open window. He was thinking about the 1803 Harlan Grove transfer. He was also thinking about something else, which he was being precise with himself about not naming directly. The truth was, and Whitmore was a man who required himself to be truthful. At least in private, he had entered the Bennet farmhouse tonight with the matter already concluded, not in an unjust way. He genuinely believed the crossing had been built with Whitmore timber on land that was at minimum in question. His surveyor had told him so. His own review of the records he possessed had suggested so. He had come to the dinner as a courtesy because the Bennets were decent people, and because George Bennet's father had known his own father, and it seemed like the civil thing to do to explain the situation in person rather than through a legal notice. He had not expected to be wrong. He was not in the general course of his life wrong very often. He employed good people specifically to make sure of this. His surveyor was thorough. His records man was careful. His lawyers were among the best in the county. He had a working system for ensuring accuracy, and it worked. It had not worked in this case apparently, because no one had checked the 1803 transfer record, and the reason no one had checked it was that no one had thought to look past 1799. And the reason a farmer's daughter at a dinner table had found what his professional surveyor had missed was that she had apparently read every county land record she could get her hands on because she found property law interesting. He turned this fact over in his mind, She had not been angry. That was the other thing. He had expected anger or fear, which was what he more commonly encountered, but Clara Bennett had been neither angry nor afraid. She had been calm. She had been precise. She had looked at him directly with blue eyes that seemed to understand him more clearly than he was entirely comfortable with, and she had told him he was wrong with the particular confidence of a person who has checked her facts multiple times and is not interested in pretending otherwise to spare his feelings. She had said, "I reckon that's worth paying attention to." He looked out at the July fields. "James," he said. "Sir." "What do you know about George Bennett's family?" James was quiet for a moment. "Decent farming family. Been on that land 30 years. George Bennett's father was one of the original settlers in that section. 3 children, older boy works the farm girls, the eldest young one's still a child. Girl's the one who—" He paused. "She's the one who reads." "Who reads?" "County Record Office in Harrisonburg. John Alderton, the clerk's son, mentioned it once at the market. Said a Bennett girl comes in regular to read the land records. Thought it was unusual. Remembered it." Whitmore was quiet for a moment. "Turn around," he said. James didn't turn around, but he did slow down further. "Sir." "Not tonight," Whitmore said. "Drive on." He paused. "But turn us around in the morning. I need to speak with the county surveyor before the week is out." "Bapiche." She was in the east field when he came back. Not the next morning, she'd half expected him then, or at least a message. But 3 days later, in the full heat of a Thursday afternoon, when she was walking the fence line along the eastern boundary with a notebook and the 1806 survey map, checking the marker stones, she heard the horse before she saw the rider. A single horse, not the carriage that registered as deliberate. A man who comes in a carriage arrives as a formal visit. A man who comes on horseback arrives to work. She turned around. Jonathan Whitmore pulled up at the edge of the field on a bay horse and looked down at her from the saddle. He was dressed plainly for him, dark riding clothes, no coat, his hat at a practical angle against the afternoon sun. He looked more human than he had at the dinner table, which surprised her. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Mr. Whitmore." She kept her notebook open in her hands. "Were you looking for my father?" "No," he said. He dismounted, which she hadn't expected, and tied the horse to the fence post with quick practiced movements. "I was looking for you." She waited. He walked toward her across the field. The heat was heavy, and the grass was dry underfoot, and the cicadas were going in the trees along the creek. He stopped a respectful distance away and took off his hat. "I spoke with the county surveyor," he said, "yesterday afternoon. And you were right about the grove." He said it directly without qualification. "The 1803 transfer was clear. My surveyor had the wrong base map. I've corrected the record." Clara looked at him. "I owe you an apology," he said, and the words sounded like they came from genuine intention rather than social obligation. "And an explanation. My man should have checked further back. He didn't. I take responsibility for that." "I appreciate that," she said. He was watching her with that same quality of attention he'd brought to the dinner table, the sense of someone who was in the strictest sense of the word paying attention. Looking at her, not past her. Listening for what she actually said rather than what he expected to hear. "I also have a question," he said. "All right. The 1806 boundary assessment." He nodded toward the notebook in her hands. "You cited it at dinner. I reviewed my copy last night. It's incomplete. 2 pages are missing from my records. What does the complete assessment say about the eastern line?" Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she held out her notebook open to the page where she'd copied out the relevant section. He took it. He read it carefully, in the same way he'd read the documents at dinner thoroughly with real attention. His brow furrowed once at something on the page. "The marker stone," he said. "At the lower bend." "It was moved," Clara said. "Sometime between 1806 and 1810. The assessment records its original placement, but when I walked the line 2 summers ago, the stone was 6 feet south of where the assessment places it." He looked up at her. "You walked the line." My father and I did. 2 summers ago. She paused. Someone moved the stone, Mr. Whitmore. I don't know when or why. But the boundary recorded in 1806 and the physical marker on the ground don't agree. He was very still for a moment. Which means, he said slowly. Which means, the boundary question isn't just about the crossing, she said. It's about 18 feet of land along the entire eastern line. He absorbed this. She watched him absorb it, the quick invisible work of a sharp mind, processing new information and its implications. He didn't bluster. He didn't dismiss it. He looked at the notebook page, and then at the eastern fence line, and then at the ground as though he were trying to see through 30 years of Virginia summers, to the place where the stone had originally stood. The original assessment, he said. Do you know where the county copy is filed? Harrisonburg clerk's office, she said. Filing cabinet in the back room, 1800 to 1810 section. 3rd drawer from the bottom. He looked at her. I've been there several times, she said simply. He was quiet for a long moment. Miss Bennet, he said. I reckon I may have badly underestimated you. Most people do, she said, and there was no bitterness in it, just the calm statement of a fact she had long since made her peace with. He looked at her. Something moved through his expression that she still couldn't quite name. It was more complicated than the expressions she was used to reading, layered in a way that suggested a complicated interior life that he kept very carefully to himself. He handed the notebook back. I'd like to walk the eastern line, he said. With you if you're willing. Today, if you have the time. Clara looked at him for a moment. I have the time, she said. They walked the eastern fence line for 2 hours in the July heat. She showed him the marker stones, the ones that were where the 1806 assessment placed them, and the one that wasn't. He crouched down in the dry grass and examined the ground around the misplaced stone, the way a man examines something he is going to have to make a decision about. He asked 3 questions, all of them precise. She answered them. They argued about the 3rd one. It was about the survey methodology used in 1806, specifically about whether the assessor's reference point had been the creek center line or the flood margin, which made an 18-inch difference in the eastern boundary measurement. Clara held for the flood margin. Whitmore held for the center line. They each laid out their reasoning in the clipped, thorough way of 2 people who are not performing an argument but genuinely having one. It went on for 10 minutes. Clara won it because she had the 1797 survey to cite, which used the same assessor and clearly documented his methodology as flood margin reference. Whitmore conceded this with the same directness he'd brought to the Grove question. No hedging, no saving face, just a short pause, and then, you're right, the flood margin. He didn't say it easily, but he said it. They walked on. The sun was lower by the time they reached the north corner of the field. The heat had eased slightly, and there was a suggestion of a breeze from the west. How long have you been reading the county records? He asked. Since I was 16, she said. My father had copies of some of the older ones. I started with those, then went to the clerk's office when I was old enough to go to town on my own. Why? She thought about how to answer that. Because land is everything here, she said finally. It's not just property, it's what families build on, what they pass down, what they lose when something goes wrong and they don't know their rights. She paused. My grandfather lost 40 acres in 1798 because he didn't know the county had recorded a boundary error that a lawyer could have corrected in an afternoon. He died not knowing it. My father still doesn't know. I think it would hurt him too much to hear it. Whitmore was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, he said. And he meant it. She could tell. I started reading the records because I didn't want that to happen again, she said. To this farm. To my father. She looked at the fence line. Land records are just stories. The story of who was here and what they built and what someone tried to take from them. I find it worth knowing. He didn't answer immediately. When she glanced at him, he was looking at the field, at the dry July grass and the fence posts, and the distant line of the creek with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something quieter than his usual manner. Something that looked almost like the face of a man thinking about something he hadn't thought about in a long time. "My father built Whitmore Hall in 1786. He said, not quite to her, more to the field. He came here with nothing, hired men, worked alongside them. He knew every acre by the feel of it under his boots." A pause. "I inherited 4,000 acres. I have never walked the way he walked them." Clara looked at him. "I send surveyors," he said. "I review reports. I sign documents." He turned to look at her. "I have never stood in a field and looked at the ground the way you just showed me that marker stone." She didn't say anything. "That is a problem," he said, and the two words had a weight to them that she suspected he didn't often allow himself. "It's a fixable problem," she said. He looked at her. Something in the quality of his attention shifted, became if possible more focused. More, she searched for the word direct, as though they had moved without her quite registering the moment of transition from a property dispute to something else entirely. "I reckon so," he said quietly. The evening was coming on. The fireflies were starting up in the grass along the fence line, the same way they'd been starting up 3 days ago when his carriage rolled up the Bennett Road. Clara became aware that they had been walking and talking for 2 hours, and that she had been arguing with Jonathan Whitmore about survey methodology and marker stones and flood margins, and that at no point in those 2 hours had she been afraid of him or careful around him or aware of the distance between his world and hers. She had just been herself. She found that she wasn't sure what to do with that. "I should go in," she said. "My mother will have supper on." "Of course." He put his hat back on. He looked at the fence line one more time, then at her. "Miss Bennett." "Mr. Whitmore, I'll have the eastern boundary reassessed," he said. "Properly this time from the original 1797 reference points. If the line needs correcting, it will be corrected." He paused. "And I'll have someone look into the moved stone. I want to know when it happened." "I'd appreciate that," she said. He nodded. He started back toward where he'd tied his horse. Then he stopped. He stood there for a moment with his back to her in the fading July light, and she saw his shoulders move very slightly, one of those small interior movements of a person deciding something. He turned around. "Miss Bennett," he said. She waited. "I've had a great many conversations about land and law and property," he said. "In offices, in county assemblies, with surveyors and lawyers and clerks." He paused. "I cannot recall the last time I had a conversation that—" He stopped again. "That what?" she asked, and her voice was very quiet. He looked at her across the dry July field in the long light of a summer evening with the fireflies beginning their slow work in the grass between them. "That I learned something from," he said, and then he put on his hat, walked to his horse, mounted with the easy practice of a man who had ridden all his life, and rode back down the Bennett Road without looking back. Clara stood at the north corner of the east field for a long moment. She looked at the fence line. She looked at the misplaced marker stone. She looked at the place where his horse had disappeared around the bend in the road. She opened her notebook. She wrote down 3 things: the location of the stone, the discrepancy in feet, and the date. Then she wrote one more thing, small and precise, in the lower margin of the page in her careful handwriting. She looked at it for a moment. Then she closed the notebook and walked back to the house where the lights were on and supper was on the table, and her family was waiting. George Bennett looked up when she came in through the kitchen door. "You were in the east field a long time," he said. "I was checking the fence line." He studied her face in the particular way fathers study daughters when they are not sure what they are seeing. "Was someone out there with you?" he asked carefully. Clara hung her hat on the peg by the door. "Mr. Whitmore came to look at the marker stone," she said. "The one that's in the wrong place. I showed him the 1806 assessment." George was very quiet for a moment. "He's having the eastern line reassessed," she said. From the 1797 reference points. Her father set down his fork. He looked at her with an expression that combined relief and confusion, and something else, something paternal, and wondering, and slightly worried. "Clara," he said. "Supper smells good, Papa," she said, sitting down. "Is that the salt pork, eh?" George Bennett looked at his daughter for another moment. Then he looked at Eleanor, who was at the stove and had her back to them and was possibly smiling. Then he picked up his fork. "Your mother made Johnny cakes," he said. Clara reached for the breadbasket. Outside through the kitchen window, the last light was going from the Virginia sky and the fireflies were thick over the south field. And somewhere down the county road, she supposed a bay horse was carrying a man home, who was thinking about boundary markers and flood margins, and the things a farmer's daughter had taught him about land he thought he knew. She reached for her water glass. She thought, "He learns." That was the thing she thought. In all of it, the dinner, the apology, the 2 hours on the fence line, the thing that stayed with her was not his wealth or his bearing or the particular quality of his dark eyes in the July light. It was that. When he was wrong, he said so. When he didn't know something, he asked. When someone showed him a thing he had missed, he looked at it. He learned. She had known very few people in her life who did that as cleanly and as honestly as Jonathan Whitmore had done it today in the East Field. She ate her Johnny cakes. She thought about the notebook entry in the margin, the small thing she'd written, and then looked at, and then decided to leave there. She thought she probably ought to scratch it out the next time she opened the notebook. She thought, too, that she probably wouldn't. The eastern boundary reassessment took 4 days. Clara knew this because she counted them. Not because she was waiting for Jonathan Whitmore specifically. She told herself this with some firmness on the second morning, when she caught herself listening for hoofbeats on the county road, but because the reassessment had direct legal implications for the farm, and it was reasonable to track how long a thing like that took. On the first day, a Whitmore surveyor named Pratt arrived at the farm with 2 assistants and a set of instruments, and spent the morning walking the eastern line with George Bennett. Clara watched from the kitchen window and noted that Pratt was thorough, which was a relief. He checked every stone. He referenced his maps twice for each measurement. He did not appear to be cutting corners. On the second day, nothing came from the Whitmore estate. On the third day, a letter arrived addressed to George Bennett in a clean, economical hand that Clara recognized immediately as belonging to a man who wrote the way he spoke. No wasted words, no ornamentation, everything precisely placed. George read it at the kitchen table. He read it twice. Then he set it down and looked at Clara across the table with the expression she had been waiting for, and dreading slightly, and also, if she was entirely honest, needing. "He's confirmed the boundary," George said. "The original 1797 line. The eastern fence needs to be moved 12 feet north." Clara set down her coffee. "In our favor," her father added quietly. She nodded. George looked at the letter again. "He's also—" He paused. "He's offering to send men to move the fence, at his expense. He says—" George's voice went careful. "He says it's the least that's owed for the inconvenience of the error." Clara looked at the table. "And he's asked," George continued, "whether you would be willing to consult on the northwest boundary next month. He has a similar question about the 1802 Marlin property transfer and whether it affects a shared drainage easement." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "He wants to hire you," George said. "He wants information," Clara said. "Clara." "I'll think about it," she said, and stood up and carried her coffee cup to the sink, which meant the conversation was finished. She stood at the sink and looked out the window at the east field where in 12 feet of dry summer grass the fence was apparently in the wrong place, and Jonathan Whitmore had said so in writing without anyone making him. She thought, "He does what he says he'll do." She added that to the small private list she was keeping against her better judgment of things she had observed about Jonathan Whitmore that were not what she had expected. It was getting to be a longer list than she was entirely comfortable with. She sent a reply through her father the next morning. She would consult on the northwest boundary question. Not for hire. She was careful about that word, because she was not sure what accepting money from Jonathan Whitmore would mean or imply, and she had learned early that what a thing implies matters as much as what it is. She would consult as a neighbor, as a county resident with access to records that might clarify the matter. She wrote the reply herself in the kitchen with the same careful attention she brought to the land records. She read it, once changed one word willing to able which was more accurate, and sent it. The reply came back the same afternoon. Miss Bennett. Thank you. I would be grateful. Tuesday, if convenient. J. Whitmore. Tuesday was 3 days away. Clara went back to the county records. She had not told anyone about the notebook margin entry, not her mother who noticed most things, not her younger sister Ruth who noticed everything and could be trusted to say nothing about it, but would look at Clara with large knowing eyes for the foreseeable future. Certainly not Thomas, who was 14 and handled all information like a man playing cards for the first time enthusiastically and without strategy. The entry said, "He listens." That was all. 2 words. She had written them in the margin below the note about the marker stone in the fading July light, and then she had looked at them for a moment, and then she had closed the notebook and walked back to the house. 2 words were not a problem. 2 words were an observation, a data point, a notation in a document she kept for practical purposes. She was a person who paid attention. She paid attention to land records and survey methodology and property law. She paid attention to the way people spoke and what they meant beyond what they said. She paid attention to small things, the moved marker stone, the missing pages in the 1806 assessment, the habit a man had of setting down his spoon with particular care before he said something important. 2 words in a margin were simply the result of paying attention. She told herself this while she was reading the 1802 Marlin transfer on Sunday evening, and she told herself this again while she was checking the Northwest boundary notes on Monday morning, and she was still telling herself this on Tuesday when she heard a horse on the county road and looked up from the fence post she was examining and saw Jonathan Whitmore riding toward her through the summer heat. He had come alone again, no surveyor, no assistant, just the bay horse and a leather document case strapped behind the saddle. She stood up straight and waited. He pulled up and dismounted and tied the horse and took the document case from the saddle with movements that were, she had noticed, always economical, never hurried, never wasteful, just precise, like a man who had a clear picture in his head of what he meant to do and did it. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Mr. Whitmore." She nodded at the document case. "You brought the Marlin transfer and the 1799 survey of the Northwest section," he said. "My records man found a discrepancy in the drainage notation I'd like your eyes on." Your eyes. She noted that phrase, the specific, practical confidence of it. Not your opinion. Not your thoughts if you have them. Your eyes. As though he had already established in his own accounting that her eyes on a document were worth having. "All right," she said. "Let's see it." They spread the documents on the flat top of the fence post, the 1802 transfer, the 1799 survey, his records man's notation of the discrepancy. She looked at them in the order she always looked at documents, oldest first, then forward. She found the discrepancy in 4 minutes. "Your records man is right," she said. "But it's not the drainage notation that's wrong, it's the reference parcel." She put her finger on the survey. "This mark, see that? That's the Harlan parcel reference, not the Marlin one. Someone transposed them. The drainage easement runs 30 feet east of where your notation places it." Whitmore leaned in to look at where she was pointing. He was close, not improperly, so just the practical proximity of 2 people examining the same document, and she was aware of that proximity without looking up from the paper. "Show me," he said. She showed him. She walked him through the reference parcel error, the transposition, the correct drainage line. He followed it without her having to repeat herself, which she appreciated. Some people needed things said twice, which was fine. Whitmore needed them said once and asked clarifying questions, which was better. He asked 2. She answered both. "So the drainage easement," he said slowly, "runs across the Morrison property, not the old Harlan section." "Yes. Which means the Morrison family has been paying maintenance on an easement that isn't theirs. For about 12 years if the transfer date holds." Whitmore was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the survey with the expression she had come to associate with him, that clean, focused absorption of information that made him look briefly less like the most powerful man in 3 counties and more like a person genuinely thinking. "The Morrisons," he said. "Samuel Morrison," she said. "He died last year. His widow Emma runs the farm now with her son." She paused. "They're not wealthy people." He looked at her. "I know," he said, and the 2 words had a particular quality, not defensive, not dismissive, but weighted, like a man taking something onto his conscience. She held his gaze for a moment. "I can document the error fully," she said. "Dates amounts the correction needed. If you want to bring it to the county clerk, do that," he said. "Please." And then, because he apparently felt that was insufficient, "I'll have my lawyer contact Emma Morrison directly. Whatever she's overpaid will be returned." Clara looked at the documents. "You didn't have to offer that," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I reckon it's right." She refolded the survey. And that was the moment, not the dinner, not the East Field, not the 2 hours of walking fence line in the July heat. That was the moment she stopped arguing with the thing she'd written in the margin of her notebook. Because a man could be wrong about a property line and correct it honestly, and that was decency. But a man who corrected a wrong he'd had no part in creating quietly and without being asked, because a woman he'd met 2 weeks ago mentioned that a widow farmer was bearing a cost she shouldn't. That was something different. She folded the transfer document with careful hands and said nothing. They were walking back toward the farmhouse. It was approaching noon, and Eleanor would have food. She always had food when there was any possibility of company, when Charles Harrington's carriage came up the county road. Clara heard it before she saw it. A fast pace for the heat of the day, 2 horses pulling a well-appointed black carriage that she recognized immediately, and with a specific practiced wariness that she had developed over the past several years. Charles Harrington was 39 years old, held 300 acres on the west side of the valley, and was in the assessment of most of Rockingham County a prosperous and respectable man. In Clara's assessment, which she kept mostly to herself, he was a man who had learned very early that wealth and a pleasant manner covered a multitude of things that didn't bear examining too closely. He had come to call on Clara twice in the past year. Her father had received him politely. Her mother had served tea with the careful neutrality of a woman managing competing obligations. Clara had been both times cordial and precise and as brief as civility allowed. The carriage stopped. Harrington stepped out and saw them. Clara and Whitmore standing at the edge of the road with a document case and the clear physical ease of 2 people who had been in conversation for some time. His expression did a quick controlled thing that Clara catalogued immediately. "Whitmore," he said, extending his hand. His voice was warm. "What a coincidence. I heard you'd been settling some boundary business with the Bennetts." "Mr. Harrington," Whitmore said. He shook the hand. His voice was even neutral. Harrington turned to Clara with the particular smile he used with her, the one that was designed to be read as admiring while functioning as something more like assessing. "Miss Bennet, you're looking well." "Mr. Harrington," she said. "I came to call on your father," Harrington said, shifting his gaze briefly back to Whitmore and then settling it on Clara again. "I understand there was some concern about the eastern boundary. I wanted to make sure everything had been resolved satisfactorily." He paused. "To your family's benefit, of course." Clara held his gaze. He knew, she thought. Of course he knew the Whitmore surveyor had been visible from the road for 2 full days, and Rockingham County was not a large place. He had come because he had heard that Jonathan Whitmore was conducting business with the Bennett family, and he had wanted to see it for himself. "The eastern boundary has been resolved," she said, "correctly and completely. Glad to hear it." He smiled. He glanced again at Whitmore. "I didn't realize you'd taken a particular interest in the Bennett property, Jonathan." Whitmore said, "I had records to correct." His voice was pleasant and entirely final. "Good afternoon, Charles." Harrington's smile held for a beat longer than comfortable. Then he turned back to Clara. "I'll go call on your father then, if you're not too occupied." The word occupied landed with a specific inflection. Not quite an accusation, not quite a suggestion, just close enough to both that anyone paying attention would notice. Clara said, "Of course. Papa's in the barn." Harrington nodded to Whitmore. Whitmore nodded back. Harrington walked toward the farmhouse with the easy stride of a man who wanted to appear unbothered. Whitmore watched him go. "He comes here often?" he asked, and his voice had gone very carefully neutral, in a way that Clara's ear picked up as deliberate. "Occasionally," she said. "With what purpose?" She looked at him. He met her gaze and had the decency to look briefly like a man who was aware he had overstepped. "Forgive me," he said. "That's not my business." "No," she said. "It isn't." He nodded once. He picked up the document case. "I'll have my lawyer draft the Morrison correction this week. I'll have the full documentation ready by Thursday." "Thank you." He mounted his horse. She stood in the road and watched him, and he was halfway to the bend when he pulled up and turned around, not all the way, just enough to look back at her over his shoulder, and said, "Miss Bennett." "Yes." "Harrington offered to buy the eastern section 2 years ago," he said. "Did you know that?" She went still. "From my records man," Whitmore said, watching her face. "He mentioned it last week. Apparently Harrington approached your father directly." "My father didn't mention it," she said carefully. "No," Whitmore said. "I reckon he didn't want to worry you." He paused. "I thought you ought to know." Then he turned the horse and rode on, and Clara stood in the July road watching him go with the specific feeling of a person who has just been handed a piece of information that changes the shape of something she thought she already understood. She found her father in the barn. He was checking the harness on the draft horse, a task he performed when he needed to do something with his hands while he thought, and he looked up when she came in with the particular expression of a man who has been expecting a conversation and has not yet decided what he will say in it. Harrington's carriage was visible through the barn door still in the yard. "Papa," she said. "Clara?" "Did Charles Harrington offer to buy the eastern section?" George Bennett's hands went still on the harness. 2 years ago," she said. "Did he?" Her father was quiet for a long moment. The barn was warm and smelled of hay and animal and the particular dry heat of a Virginia summer, and the draft horse shifted his weight and exhaled slowly. "He did," George said. "And you didn't tell me." "It was a business matter, Clara. Between men." "It was our land, Papa. It's my land, too." George turned to look at her. He had her grandfather's eyes, patient and steady, and occasionally burdened with more than they wanted to show. "He offered a fair price," he said. "I said no. That was the end of it. And then he offered again." A pause. "Papa?" "Once more," George admitted. "Last spring. I said no again. And then Jonathan Whitmore started looking at the eastern boundary," Clara said, and she heard the pieces clicking together in her own voice as she said it. "And Harrington comes calling 2 weeks later." Her father looked at her. "He knows the boundary records are wrong," she said. Or he suspected it. And he knew that if Whitmore claimed the eastern section, or if the boundary dispute dragged on long enough, we'd be more likely to sell. She stopped. "He wasn't trying to buy land, Papa. He was waiting for us to need to sell it." George Bennett set down the harness piece in his hand. He looked older suddenly, not frail, not weak, but tired in the way of a man who has been carrying something heavy and has been found out. "I know what he was doing," he said quietly. "I'm not a fool, Clara. I know what Charles Harrington has been doing." She softened. "I know you do." "I handled it." "I know." "You don't have to." He stopped. He picked up the harness piece again, turned it over in his hands. "You don't have to protect this farm from me, daughter." She went to stand beside him. She put her hand briefly on his arm, the same strong, work-scarred arm that had lifted her up to see over fences when she was small, that had guided her hand across her first survey map when she was 12. "I'm not protecting it from you," she said. "I'm protecting it with you." He covered her hand with his and squeezed once. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. From the yard she could hear Harrington's voice, smooth and social, talking to her mother at the kitchen door. She could hear her mother's voice returning pleasant and careful, the way Eleanor was always pleasant and careful, with things she had correctly identified as requiring management. "I should go back out there," George said. "I'll come with you," Clara said. And the conversation with Harrington at the kitchen table lasted 40 minutes, and Clara was present for all of it. He was good at it, she would give him that. He was warm and expansive and full of neighborly concern, and he asked after young Thomas with what seemed like genuine interest, and he complimented Eleanor's coffee in a way that landed precisely between courtly and natural. He talked about the county assembly coming up in September, the new road to Harrisonburg, the dry summer, and what it would mean for the fall harvest. He did not mention the eastern section. He did not mention Whitmore. He behaved in every outward particular like a prosperous neighbor paying a friendly call. And then, toward the end, while Eleanor was refilling his cup, he said to George, very casually, "I understand Whitmore's been reconsidering some of his boundary positions on the eastern side. Must have been a relief getting that settled." George said, "It was straightforward once the records were reviewed." "Clara did the reviewing, I understand." Harrington turned to her with the assessing smile. "You have a gift, Miss Bennet. Remarkable thing, a woman with a head for property law." Clara looked at him. "Of course," he continued, "it must be a great deal of work maintaining all that knowledge, without a formal arrangement." He set his cup down. "If you ever wanted to put that talent to proper use in a household with real resources behind it, that would be something worth having." The kitchen went quiet in a particular way. Her mother's hand paused over the coffee pot. Her father looked at the table. Clara looked at Charles Harrington with calm, complete attention. "Mr. Harrington," she said, "are you asking me to work for you?" He smiled. "I'm asking you to consider your future, Miss Bennet." "I consider it regularly," she said. "Thank you." "A woman with your abilities has decided on her own direction," she said pleasantly. "Thank you for the compliment, and for the call." She stood up. "I'll let you and Papa finish your coffee." She walked out of the kitchen through the parlor and onto the front porch where she stood in the July heat, with her hands at her sides, and breathed. Behind her, through the window, she could hear the conversation resume her father's careful voice. Harrington's smooth one, her mother's neutral, competent management of the whole thing. She heard under all of it the particular sound of a man who had offered to solve a problem he had partly created and been refused and was now deciding what to do next. She thought, he will not stop. That was the thing about Charles Harrington. He was patient. He thought in years, not months. He would not raise his voice or make a scene because he didn't need to. He was the kind of man who simply kept returning until the right combination of circumstances finally aligned in his favor. The question was what the right circumstances looked like and whether she could see them before they arrived. She was still standing on the porch when she heard the carriage leave. The county assembly in September was 3 weeks away when the rumors started. She heard the first one from Martha Alderton, the county clerk's wife, who had known the Bennet family for 20 years and who came to tell Clara because she was the kind of woman who believed in knowing even when knowing was uncomfortable. "People are talking," Martha said. They were in the Alderton kitchen on a Thursday morning, and Martha had the direct, careful manner of someone delivering news she didn't enjoy delivering. "About you and Whitmore." Clara set down her tea. "What about us?" "That you've been meeting privately, multiple times. That it's—" Martha paused, choosing the word with visible care. "Inappropriate." The word landed in the room with the particular weight of something designed to wound. Clara was quiet for a moment. "We've been reviewing county land records," she said. "In the open, on my family's property, with the full knowledge of my parents." "I know that," Martha said. "I know exactly what it is. I'm telling you what people are saying it is." "Who is saying it?" Martha looked at her hands. "I have my suspicions." Clara said nothing. She didn't need to. Harrington had been in the county clerk's office twice in the past week, John Alderton had mentioned it in passing, and he had not been there about land records. He's also saying, Martha continued more quietly, that you embarrassed Whitmore at dinner, that you made him look foolish in front of your family, and that he's only continued the business arrangement to save face. Clara absorbed this, and that, if Jonathan Whitmore knew what people were saying about his dignity, Martha finished, he would want nothing more to do with the Bennett family. Clara picked up her tea and took a careful sip. Thank you, Martha, she said. I mean that. What are you going to do? What I always do, Clara said. Pay attention. She went to see Whitmore. She did not tell her father. She told her mother because her mother would find out regardless, and it was better to be the one doing the telling. Eleanor listened to the full account, the rumors Harrington's likely role the county assembly, the implication without interruption, and when Clara was done, Eleanor said, Do you think Whitmore has heard? I don't know, Clara said. I think he might, and I think it matters that he hears the truth of it before someone else's version of events gets there first. Eleanor looked at her daughter for a long, quiet moment. Take the Bay Road, she said finally. It's faster. Clara took the Bay Road. 10. The Whitmore estate was as a physical fact considerably larger than she had allowed herself to think about. The main house was a large federal-style building in red brick, set back from the road by a long avenue of oaks that had been growing for at least 30 years. There were outbuildings, stable gardens. The whole of it was neat and well-maintained, in a way that spoke to the labor of many people quietly arranged, so that what you mostly noticed was the result and not the work behind it. She dismounted at this gate and walked her horse up the avenue. A groom met her at the stable yard, with the particular expression of a man who had not been expecting a woman to arrive alone on horseback, and was managing his surprise with professional dignity. Is Mr. Whitmore receiving? She asked. May I say who's calling Miss Clara Bennett? The groom went inside. She stood in the stable yard in the morning heat and waited, and she did not look at the house or the grounds or any of the concrete evidence of the distance between Jonathan Whitmore's world and her own, because she had come here to say a specific thing and she needed to stay focused on saying it. The groom came back. Mr. Whitmore will see you, Miss Bennett, if you'll follow me. He was in his study, which was a room full of books and documents, and the working evidence of a man who ran a large operation, ledgers, maps, correspondence in organized stacks. He was standing when she came in, which she registered as deliberate. Miss Bennett. His voice was measured. This is unexpected. I know, she said. I won't take much of your time. She didn't sit down because sitting down would make the conversation longer, and she wanted to keep it short and direct. I've heard what's being said in the county, about our meetings, about the boundary work. He was very still. I wanted you to hear from me directly, she said. What those meetings were, what they weren't, and who I believe is behind what's being said. He said nothing for a moment. Then, sit down, Miss Bennett. I'd rather stand. I'd rather you sit, he said, and his voice was not unkind. This is going to take more than a few minutes. She looked at him. She sat down. He sat across from her and looked at her with the particular directness she had come to expect from him, the full, unguarded attention he brought to things he was taking seriously. I've heard the rumors, he said. I thought you might have. They're false. Yes, she said. They are. I know that. He said it flatly without emphasis, as though it required no argument. I'm not asking you to defend your conduct, Miss Bennett. I'm perfectly capable of knowing what happened in my own business meetings. She held his gaze. What I want to know, he said carefully, is whether you've been harmed by this. Your family's reputation. Your standing in the community. Something in her chest tightened unexpectedly. Not because the question surprised her, she had anticipated it, but because of the specific quality of it. Not what is being said about me. What is being said about you? Martha Alderton has been a friend for 20 years, she said. She told me first, which means she was trying to protect me. Others may not be so careful. She paused. My standing is it will require management. Because of meetings that served legitimate county business. Because I'm a farmer's daughter who has been seen twice in conversation with Jonathan Whitmore, she said with more directness than she usually allowed herself. In this county, in this year, that is enough. He was quiet for a moment. The man behind this, he said. I believe so. Harrington. Not a question. He offered twice to buy the eastern section, she said. He came to call last week after you'd resolved the boundary question. He is patient and systematic. Whitmore looked at his desk. He looked at his hands. He looked at the middle distance in the way he looked when he was processing something that had both practical implications and something less quantifiable. He's been a business associate for 8 years, he said quietly. I know. I've sold him timber rights. He's attended dinners at this house. A pause. I thought I knew what kind of man he was. You may still know, she said carefully. You just may not have seen this particular kind. He looked at her sharply. Capable men are capable of many things, she said. Doesn't mean they're capable of all of them. Some men are honest in business and calculating in other ways. He was quiet for a long moment. What are you asking me to do? He said. She shook her head. I'm not asking you to do anything. I came to tell you the truth of the situation before someone else's version reached you. That's all. She stood up. What you do with it is your business. He stood as well. Miss Bennet. His voice stopped her at the door. She turned. He was standing behind his desk with his hands at his sides, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked not uncertain that wasn't the right word. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a thing he hadn't expected to be standing at the edge of. Harrington is going to the county assembly, he said. I expect so. So are you. My family usually attends. He nodded slowly. Then I suppose, he said in the particular voice he used when he had made a decision that he was going to stand by regardless of what it cost him, that I will see you there. She looked at him. She thought, he is not going to let this stand. She thought I am not sure what that means. She thought I am going to have to stop pretending I don't know exactly what that means. Good afternoon, Mr. Whitmore, she said. Good afternoon, Miss Bennet. She walked out through the hall, through the front door, down the oak avenue, and out to where her horse was waiting in the shade. She mounted and rode back down the Bay Road in the full heat of the August morning, and she did not let herself think about the expression on Jonathan Whitmore's face until she was well clear of his property. Then she let herself think about it. She thought about it for the rest of the ride home, and she did not resolve it. And when she arrived at the farm and put her horse in the barn and went inside to help her mother with the noon meal, she was still thinking about it. Well, Eleanor said without looking up from the stove. He knew, Clara said. About the rumors. Eleanor nodded once. He said they were false. Clara picked up a knife and started cutting bread. Just like that, no questions, no hesitation. Her mother was quiet for a moment. And Clara cut 3 more slices. He said he'd see us at the county assembly, she said. Eleanor turned from the stove and looked at her daughter. Clara set down the knife and looked back. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Eleanor turned back to the stove and said, Set the table, please. Your father will be in from the field in 10 minutes. Clara set the table. She set it carefully. All 4 places, the way her grandmother had taught her fork, on the left knife and spoon, on the right glasses aligned, and she thought about the county assembly 3 weeks away, and Charles Harrington's patient, systematic maneuvering, and the particular quality of Jonathan Whitmore's voice when he said, I suppose I will see you there, and the notebook in the parlor desk with the 2 words in the margin. She put the bread on the table. She thought, this is not finished. She thought, it has in fact barely begun. And outside the August heat pressed down on the Virginia fields, and the creek ran quiet along the eastern boundary, the right boundary now, the honest one, And somewhere in a county that was watching and talking and deciding what it thought, two people were separately preparing for a September assembly that neither of them could quite look at directly yet. But they were preparing. The county assembly in Rockingham met on the third Saturday of September in the meeting hall on the main road through Harrisonburg that had been used for every public gathering of consequence since 1791. Clara had been attending since she was 12 years old, seated between her parents in the third row of plain wooden chairs, learning the particular grammar of how decisions were made in public when men had already made them in private. She understood by the time she was 16 that the assembly was not where things were decided. It was where they were announced. The deciding happened in offices and on front porches and in the backs of general stores, in the conversations that men had when they thought no women were listening. The assembly was the theater of it. The conclusion written ahead of time performed for the record. She had spent the 3 weeks since her visit to Whitmore's estate preparing for what she knew was coming. She had gone to the county clerk's office twice. She had pulled the drainage easement file, the eastern boundary correction, the full history of the Marlin property transfer. She had organized everything in a folder that now sat in the parlor desk alongside the original land deed and the 1797 survey. She had written out in clear, precise sentences a summary of every correction made, every record consulted, every error identified. She had also carefully, and without telling anyone, written out a second document. This one was not about land records. It was about Charles Harrington. It itemized his 2 purchase offers to her father, the dates and approximate terms. It noted his visit the week the Whitmore survey began. It noted the rumors that had reached Martha Alderton within 10 days of that visit. It noted the timing. It did not accuse. It simply placed the facts in order, which was the most powerful thing facts could do when they were arranged by someone who understood what they meant. She had not decided whether to use it, but she had it. Her mother helped her dress on the morning of the assembly without comment. Eleanor Bennet understood the function of preparation of good cloth and a straight spine and clean hands as a form of argument. She pinned Clara's hair and stepped back and looked at her daughter with the same expression she'd worn on the morning of Clara's first day at the county school when Clara was 7 years old and had wanted to run back inside. "You know what you're doing," Eleanor said. "I know what I'm doing," Clara agreed. George drove the wagon. She saw Harrington before she saw Whitmore. He was standing near the entrance to the meeting hall when the Bennett wagon pulled up, talking to 2 other county landowners, Francis Webb and old Silas Morton, with the easy social confidence of a man who had been working this room for years. He saw Clara the moment she stepped down from the wagon. His expression did the quick, controlled thing it always did, a fraction of a second of assessment, then the warm, social face. He tipped his hat to George. "Morning, Bennett." "Harrington," George said with the careful civility he used for people he had decided opinions about and was choosing not to express. Harrington turned to Clara. "Miss Bennett, you look well." His eyes moved over her once dress posture, the folder she carried under her arm, and she saw him register the folder with a minute narrowing of his gaze. "Good morning, Mr. Harrington," she said pleasantly. She went inside. She found seats in the 4th row. Her usual row was already full, which she suspected was not coincidental, and settled in with her parents on her left and Thomas on her right. Ruth had stayed home. The hall was filling fast. She knew most of the faces. She knew which ones had heard the rumors and which ones hadn't, because the ones who had were doing the specific thing people do when they're looking at someone they've been talking about, looking just slightly too much or just slightly too deliberately away. She kept her spine straight and her expression neutral and her hands quiet in her lap. She had been doing this since she was 12. She was good at it. She did not look toward the door. She was not looking toward the door when she heard the particular shift in the room's ambient sound that happened when someone significant entered. It was not loud. It was subtle, a slight change in the direction of attention, the way a room tilts toward a new center of gravity without any individual person consciously moving. She kept her eyes on the front of the hall. Jonathan Whitmore sat down in the 2nd row. She had not known until the moment she did not turn to look how much she had been hoping he would come. The assembly followed its usual form for the first hour. County road assessments. A boundary dispute between the Webb property and the Morrison farm. The Morrison drainage easement correction had been filed the prior week quietly and without fanfare, and Emma Morrison sat in the 6th row with the particular stillness of a woman who has been carrying a weight and has just had it lifted without quite believing it yet. Clara had been the one to file the correction. She had not told Whitmore in advance. He had found out, she assumed, through his lawyer, because 3 days later, a note had arrived at the farm addressed to her in that clean, economical hand. The Morrison account has been settled in full. Thank you for the documentation. J.W. She had put the note in the parlor desk. She was thinking about it when Harrington stood up. He stood with the ease of a man who had been waiting for the right moment and had decided this was it. He addressed the assembly on the matter of water access on the county's South Road, a legitimate issue, one that affected 6 farms, including his own, and he spoke about it with the practiced competence of someone who knew what he was doing. And then approximately 4 minutes into his remarks he said it. I also want to raise a concern, he said, and his voice shifted not dramatically, just enough. A matter of county record and how it's been handled. The room went slightly quieter. There have been irregularities, he said, in recent boundary assessments on the eastern side of the valley. Corrections filed without full county review, transfer records being reopened on the basis of private research conducted without official sanction. He paused. I respect diligence, but there are proper channels for a reason. When private individuals begin redirecting county records based on personal interpretations, it creates uncertainty. It creates dispute. Another pause. It creates the appearance, at least, of parties with personal interests influencing public record. The room was very quiet now. Clara kept her hands still in her lap. He didn't say her name. He didn't say Whitmore's. He didn't have to. The room knew exactly who he was talking about, and the room was looking at 2 different rows of chairs, hers, and the second row with the specific collective attention of people who have just been given permission to think what they were already thinking. George Bennett's hand tightened briefly on his knee. Thomas, to her right, went very still. Clara counted to 5. Then she stood up. The first thing she noticed was how quiet the room got, not the polite quiet of people waiting for the next speaker. The specific charged quiet of a space in which something unexpected is happening, and everyone is recalibrating simultaneously. She was a farmer's daughter in the 4th row. Women spoke at county assemblies occasionally on household and church matters by general tolerance and no formal right. She had never spoken at one before. Harrington looked at her with an expression she could only describe as delighted, the expression of a man who has baited a trap and watched it spring. She looked at him for one clear moment. Then she turned to face the front of the hall. I'd like to respond to Mr. Harrington's concern, she said, if the assembly will permit it. Jonas Hale, who ran the assembly, looked at her from the front. He was a fair man on balance. He looked at the room which was watching him. He said, The floor recognizes Miss Bennett. She opened her folder. The eastern boundary corrections Mr. Harrington references, she said, and her voice was steadier than she expected, steadier than she had any right to given what was happening in her chest. Were not conducted without official sanction. They were conducted with the full cooperation of the county surveyor's office, using original county records, and filed by Mr. Jonathan Whitmore's legal representative through the proper county clerk channels. She paused. Mr. John Alderton, the county clerk, can confirm this. I imagine he's in this room. John Alderton, who was indeed in this room, raised his hand briefly. Thank you, she said. She turned the first page. The records I reviewed were public county records available to any resident. I have been consulting them since I was 16 years old. She looked up at the room. I do not hold a legal office. I hold a reading habit and 30 years of my family's history on this land. A beat. I reckon that qualifies me to have an opinion about it. A small sound moved through the room. Not laughter, something lighter. Something almost like recognition. Harrington said smoothly. No one is questioning Miss Bennet's enthusiasm for records, Jonas. The concern is about the propriety of a young woman conducting private business with Mr. Harrington. Her voice was not loud, but it stopped him. The room held very still. She looked at him directly. I think what you mean to say, she said, with the careful precision of a person choosing each word for a specific purpose, is that you are concerned about the propriety of a woman correcting a record that was wrong, not about process, about conclusion. She held his gaze. Because the process was correct, the records are public, the filings were proper. The only thing that was irregular was that the result did not favor the account you had been building. Harrington's pleasant expression held, but something changed behind it. What account is that? He said. The one where my family's eastern section becomes available for purchase, she said. The room went so still she could hear the man beside her breathing. She heard from the second row the small, precise sound of someone who has been completely silent for 20 minutes, carefully, deliberately silent, shifting in his chair. Harrington moved first. He did what skilled men do when they are losing ground in public. He pivoted to dignity. He said with the injured air of a man who has been wrongly accused, I find it remarkable, Jonas, that a young woman is permitted to make accusations of this nature without evidence in a public assembly against a man who has been a contributing member of this community for 15 years. I made an observation about timing, Clara said. 2 purchase offers, Mr. Harrington. One in 1812. One in the spring of this year. Both declined. And then, within 6 weeks of Mr. Whitmore initiating a boundary review, you were in the county clerk's office twice, on matters that, according to Mr. Alderton's records, had no pending business to address. She looked at John Alderton again. He had the expression of a man who had not known he would be at the center of a county assembly confrontation on a Saturday morning, but was managing it with integrity. That's a matter of public record, too, she said. The clerk's visitor log. This is outrageous, Harrington said, and for the first time his voice had lost its practiced warmth. Jonas, I will not stand here and be Mr. Harrington. The voice from the second row was quiet, absolute quiet. The kind of quiet that cost nothing because it had never needed to cost anything. Jonathan Whitmore stood up. He had not spoken since he'd sat down. He had been present, fully visibly present, the kind of presence that a room is always aware of, even when it isn't looking directly at it, and he had sat through Harrington's remarks and through Clara's response with the expression of a man who had heard everything and was deciding the exact right moment to speak. Apparently this was it. He turned to face Harrington. He did not raise his voice. He did not adopt the injured dignity or the smooth social warmth or any of the performance Harrington had been running. He just looked at him with the clean, direct attention of a man who has made a decision and is communicating it. The Eastern boundary correction was legitimate, he said. I initiated it. My surveyor conducted it. My lawyer filed it. If you have a procedural objection to any of those steps, I'd be interested to hear it. A pause. But if your objection is to the result, to the fact that the Bennett family's property line was restored to its accurate recorded position, then I'd encourage you to be honest about that. This room deserves honesty. Harrington looked at him. Something passed between them. 8 years of business association dinners at Whitmore Hall. The assumption of alliance and what was left after it passed was a stranger amount of distance than either of them had probably expected. Jonathan, Harrington said, and his voice had gone quiet and careful. I'm not your enemy here. No, Whitmore said, but I reckon you've been the Bennett family's. Yad. The silence after that had a specific texture. It was not the silence of a room that had finished being surprised. It was the silence of a room that was still catching up, that had just heard a wealthy man publicly align himself with a farmer's family against another wealthy man in front of 60 witnesses, and was still processing the implications. Jonas Hale let it breathe for 5 full seconds. Then he said in his steady assembly voice, I believe the record correction concerns have been adequately addressed. Let's move on to the Morrison drainage matter. The assembly moved on. Clara sat down. Her hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady. She pressed them flat on the folder in her lap and breathed once carefully and kept her eyes on the front of the hall. Thomas leaned close and said very quietly into her ear, "Clara." "Not now," she said. "You just—" "Thomas." He sat back. Her father reached over and touched her hand. Just once, brief and quiet. She did not look at him, because if she looked at him, she was going to lose the composure she had worked very hard to maintain, and she was not going to do that here. She kept her eyes on Jonas Hale. She did not look at the second row. The assembly broke at noon. People came out into the September air, still warm, the last warmth of the year, the particular quality of Virginia September that always felt like a gift given on the way out the door and formed the smaller conversations that always followed the official one. Clara was standing with her mother and Martha Alderton when she felt the specific change in the immediate air that had become over the past 6 weeks familiar. She didn't turn around immediately. She gave herself 3 seconds. Then she turned. Whitmore was there, not immediately behind her, but close enough that the approach had been deliberate. He was alone. He was not looking at the social landscape the way Harrington was across the yard managing damage with Francis Webb and Silas Morton. He was looking at her. "Miss Bennet," he said. "Mr. Whitmore." She kept her voice even. "Thank you for what you said. In the room." It needed saying. "It cost you something." He was quiet for a moment. "Harrington and I have been doing business for 8 years, he said. "I reckon some things are worth more than 8 years of timber rights." She looked at him. She thought he knew what it would cost before he stood up. She thought he stood up anyway. Martha Alderton, with the graceful instinct of a woman who has been paying attention, said something to Eleanor about the Morrison easement and drew her 3 steps away. Clara noted this and was briefly grateful for it. Whitmore said, "You prepared for today?" "I always prepare." "You prepared for the possibility that he'd do exactly what he did." "I thought it likely," she said. "He's patient, but he's also, when he's losing ground, he moves fast. I thought the assembly would be when he moved." "And you were ready." "I was ready," she said. "But I didn't expect—" She stopped. "What?" he said. She looked at him directly. "I didn't expect you to speak." He held her gaze. "Why not?" "Because it cost you more than it cost me," she said. "Your business relationship with him. The room's opinion of why you've been at our farm. The assumptions people will make about what it means that you chose our side publicly." She paused. "People don't usually choose costs voluntarily, Mr. Whitmore. Especially not when they could have stayed quiet and suffered nothing." He was very still for a moment. "You think I chose it because it was strategic," he said carefully. "Good public relations, a show of principle." She didn't answer because she wasn't entirely sure what she thought, and she was not in the habit of saying things she wasn't sure of. Clara. Her name, without the miss. Just the name, and the way he said it, made her chest do something specific that she chose not to examine in the middle of a county assembly yard. "I chose it because it was right. And because—" He stopped. "Because what?" she said. He looked at her. Around them, the yard was full of people. The Alderton women. Francis Webb's wife Thomas, watching from across the yard with the 17 expressions of a 14-year-old who is doing his absolute best to look like he isn't watching. "Because it was right," he said again, and something in his voice had shifted, not softer but more direct. More unguarded in the way he was occasionally unguarded when he forgot for a moment to manage how much he let through. "That's enough of a reason for me." She looked at him. She said very quietly, "Yes, it is." Harrington found her 15 minutes later near the edge of the yard. She had been expecting this. When she saw him coming alone, the social face replaced now with something more careful and more honest. She turned to face him and waited. He stopped 2 feet away. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has revised his assessment of a situation and is deciding what to do with the revision. "You played that very well," he said. "I didn't play anything," she said. "I brought the records." "You knew I would make that move." "I thought you might." He studied her. "You're not what I thought you were," he said, And it was not a compliment exactly, but it was not without respect. "I'm exactly what I've always been," she said. "You just weren't paying the right kind of attention." He was quiet for a moment. "The Eastern section," he said. "That offer still stands, whenever your family is ready." She looked at him. She thought about her grandfather's 40 lost acres. She thought about her father coming inside with his hat in his hands. She thought about the marker stone moved 6 feet south sometime between 1806 and 1810 by someone who had decided that the truth of a boundary mattered less than the advantage it offered. "My family," she said, "will never be ready, respectfully." His jaw tightened, just slightly. "Good day, Mr. Harrington," she said. She walked away. She walked toward her mother, toward Martha, toward the ordinary September daylight of a Virginia assembly morning, and she did not look back, and her hands were completely steady. The ride home was quiet. George drove. Eleanor sat beside him. Thomas was in the back with Clara, and for the first mile he managed heroically for a 14-year-old to say nothing. Then he said, "You knew he was going to do that, in the assembly, before it happened." "I thought it was likely," she said. "How?" "Because he'd been in the clerk's office twice with no business," she said. "And because men like that, when they're losing ground quietly, they look for a public moment to reframe the story. Make it about something other than what they actually did." Thomas thought about this for a moment. "And Whitmore," he said carefully. "Did you know he was going to stand up?" She looked at the passing fields. "No," she said. "Were you glad he did?" She didn't answer. Thomas was quiet for another moment. Then, in the sidelong way of a boy who is smarter than he always lets on, he said, "He called you Clara." "I didn't notice," she said. "Clara," Thomas said with heavy 14-year-old significance. "Thomas. I'm just saying. Thomas George Bennett." He went quiet. She looked at the fields. She was glad. She could admit that much at least to herself. She was glad he had stood up, and she was glad he had said what he said, and she was glad she had been standing in that assembly room today, with her folder and her 30 years of county records and her grandfather's ghost at her shoulder, and that when the moment came, she had not been afraid. She was also, she admitted to herself, still thinking about the way he had said her name, not as a claim, not as a social signal, just as a name, her name, said by a man who meant it. She looked out at the Virginia September fields, gold and dry and beautiful, and she thought, this is not finished. The letter came 4 days later. It was addressed to her, not to her father. Her name on the outside in that clean, economical hand, Miss C. Bennett, and inside 2 paragraphs. The first was about business. He had reviewed the Northwest boundary file she had prepared and forwarded it to the county clerk for formal correction. A secondary discrepancy in the Pratt Farm easement had been identified as a result, which he wanted her to look at when she had the opportunity. The second paragraph was 7 sentences long. She read it 3 times. Then she folded the letter and sat with it in her lap for a moment in the September afternoon. The second paragraph said, "I owe you an honest account of something. I came to your family's dinner in July, expecting to settle a matter I believed was already settled. I had not in some years expected to be wrong about much. What you showed me that evening, and in the weeks since, is that I had become, without fully realizing it, a man who had stopped checking. I am grateful for the correction, not only about the eastern boundary." She read the last 3 words again. Not only about the eastern boundary. She sat with that for a long time. Then she went to her writing desk and she took out paper and she thought for 5 full minutes about what she wanted to say. Not what was prudent, not what was appropriate, what she actually wanted to say. She wrote 3 drafts. The first was too careful. The second was too much. The third was exactly right, 2 paragraphs clean and precise, because she was her father's daughter, and she did not ornament things that did not need ornamentation. The first paragraph addressed the Pratt easement and confirmed she would review it. The second paragraph said, "I have been corrected many times in my life, Mr. Whitmore. By my father, by county records that contradicted what I thought I knew, by the occasional stubbornness of facts that do not care for my interpretations. I have never minded correction when it came honestly. What I have minded, what I have spent most of my life minding, is being dismissed before the correction was even attempted. You have never dismissed me. I find I value that more than I expected to. She read it over once. She sealed it. She gave it to Thomas to take to the post the next morning before she could change her mind. The reply came in 2 days, which was faster than the post usually ran. It was also longer than anything he had previously written her. 4 paragraphs. Still that clean, economical hand, but with more sentences, more weight between the lines. She read it at the kitchen table. Her mother was at the stove. Her father was outside. Thomas was at school. She read the first paragraph, which was about the Pratt easement, and which was very thorough and entirely correct. She read the second, which said, "I spent the evening after the assembly thinking about what it cost you to stand up today. Not in the same terms that it cost me, we are not in the same situation, and I am not naive enough to suggest otherwise. What you risked today was different, and arguably harder, and you risked it with better preparation and more composure than most men I've seen in a courthouse." I wanted to say that plainly. She read the third, which said, "I have lived on this land my entire life, and known most of the people in this county since boyhood. I could not have told you 6 weeks ago what a county drainage easement says, or whether the 1797 survey reference matches the 1806 assessment. You taught me to look at the ground under my own feet. I do not think I can adequately explain what that has meant." She sat very still over the 4th paragraph. The 4th paragraph said, "I wonder if you would do me the honor of riding with me next Saturday morning. Not about records, not about boundaries. I find I would like to know if you are willing simply who you are beyond the woman who reads land records, though she is already someone I respect more than I can easily say." Eleanor, without turning from the stove, said, "Good news." Clara folded the letter. "The Pratt easement correction is straightforward," she said. Her mother said nothing for a moment. Then, and the rest. Clara put the letter in her apron pocket. "He's asked to go riding on Saturday," she said. Eleanor turned from the stove. She looked at her daughter, at the particular quality of stillness in Clara's face, the careful way she had of holding herself when something important was happening, and she was not yet ready to name it. "And will you?" Eleanor said. Clara looked at the window at the September light on the Virginia fields, at the long season of East boundaries and marker stones and county assemblies, and a man who had stood up in a room full of his peers and said what was right because it was right. She thought about what she'd written in the margin of her notebook. "He listens." She thought about the second entry she had added 2 weeks later in smaller letters beneath the first. "He learns." She thought about the one she had not written yet, that was forming itself somewhere below the level of words in the part of her that had been paying attention since the first evening, when a black carriage rolled up the Bennett Road, and a man filled a farmhouse doorway, and looked at her like she was something he needed to recalibrate for. "Yes," she said. "I will." Eleanor turned back to the stove. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. They rode out on Saturday morning before the heat settled in. Clara had told her father the evening before, simply and directly, the way she told him most things. She said Jonathan Whitmore had asked her to ride with him not on business, and that she had agreed. George Bennett had looked at his coffee cup for a long moment, and then looked at his daughter with the particular expression he reserved for things he had seen coming and still needed a moment to absorb. "Just riding," he said. "Just riding," she said. He nodded once. He didn't ask anything else, which was either great trust or great wisdom, and with her father, it was usually both. Whitmore arrived at 7:30 on the bay horse, and he had brought a second horse, a steady gray mare, well-mannered and good-gaited, which he'd arranged through the Alderton stable because he had known without her telling him that the Bennett farm's 2 draft horses were not riding animals. That small practical act of consideration landed somewhere in Clara's chest before she was ready for it. She mounted without help. He watched her do it with the expression he had when he was noting something but choosing not to comment. They rode north away from the county road into the quieter back country of the valley where the fields gave way to hills, and the hills gave way to timber, and there was no one to watch them, and no particular performance required of either of them. For the first mile they talked about the Pratt easement. It was comfortable, that conversation, because they both knew it well. They had a shared language, now survey dates and reference parcels and county filing procedures, and they moved through it easily, finishing each other's reasoning without needing to explain themselves. She had not had that with many people. Her father in some things, Martha Alderton in others. But not this. Not the specific ease of a person who thought the same way she did, quickly and precisely, and kept up without effort. She was aware of enjoying it more than she had expected to. Then he said, "Tell me about your grandfather." She glanced at him. "You've mentioned him twice," he said. "The 40 acres he lost in 1798. What he would have thought." He looked at her directly. "I'd like to know who he was." So she told him. She told him about Elias Bennett, who had come to Virginia from Pennsylvania in 1780 with $40 and a mule, and the particular stubbornness of a man who had decided without much evidence in his favor that things were going to be all right. Who had built the farmhouse himself, timber by timber, in the first 2 years. Who had kept a journal that Clara had read cover to cover when she was 14? A plain, practical journal, not literary, full of weather records and crop yields and the prices of things at market. And who had written on the last page, in the careful handwriting of a man unused to writing things down, "What I want for this land is that whoever comes after me knows it honestly and holds it without shame." She told him about the 40 acres and the boundary error and the county record that a lawyer could have found in an afternoon that her grandfather had never known to look for. She told it plainly, the way it was not as tragedy, because it was 30 years ago and the farm had survived it, but as the specific kind of wrong that comes not from malice, but from ignorance, which was in some ways harder to reckon with, because there was no one to be angry at. Whitmore listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I had a manager," he said, "for 12 years, a man named Aldrich. He ran the east operations, the tenant farms, the drainage, the smaller boundary questions. I trusted him completely." He paused. 3 years ago, I found out he'd been filing incorrect boundary records on 2 of the tenant properties. Nothing dramatic, just small adjustments. Half an acre here, 20 feet there. Over 12 years it added up to about 14 acres that should have belonged to the tenants. Clara looked at him. By the time I found out, he said 2 of those families had left, gone west. I have no way to find them. He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. I corrected the records for the families still there. I paid them what I could estimate the land use had been worth. He paused again. It wasn't enough. It's never going to be enough. But I didn't know what else to do. She was quiet for a moment. "How did you find out?" "I walked the land," he said. "After you showed me the marker stone, I went back and walked all of it." He glanced at her. "I found 3 discrepancies in the first week." She absorbed this. "Your grandfather," he said, "lost 40 acres because no one showed him where to look." He held her gaze for a moment. "I lost 14 acres of other people's land because I wasn't looking at all. I reckon we are both living with the weight of that." They rode in silence for a stretch. She thought about what he'd just told her, the specific quality of it, the way he had not dressed it up or minimized it or explained it away. He had just told her the thing plainly, including the part where there was no clean resolution, and he had to live with that. She thought, "He carries the same things I carry." She thought, "I did not expect that." They stopped at a creek crossing, not Patience Run, a different one further north, and let the horses drink. He had brought food which again she had not expected. Cold cornbread and dried apple slices in 2 tin cups, and he produced them from his saddlebag with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who had thought ahead and was not looking for credit for it. They sat on opposite sides of a flat rock and ate in the easy silence of people who had run out of the need to fill silence. Then he said, "What do you want, Clara?" "Not Miss Bennett." Clara. And not the polite social version of the question, Not what are your plans or what does your family intend, but the direct version, the one that actually meant something. She looked at him. For the farm, she said. No, he said. For yourself. She looked at the creek. Nobody had asked her that in quite that way, not because the people in her life didn't care. Her parents cared deeply in all the ways that matter, but because the question assumed that what she wanted was a separate thing from what the farm needed and what her family needed, and in the daily life of a farming family, those things were mostly the same thing. I want to practice property law, she said. It came out more directly than she'd planned, partly because she hadn't said it out loud to anyone before. He was quiet. I know that's not... She stopped. Women don't do that here. Not formally. Not with any standing. I know what it is. She paused. But there are families in this county losing land they shouldn't lose because they don't know their rights. They don't know where the records are, or how to read them, or what questions to ask. And the people who do know, the lawyers, the surveyors, they work for, the people who can pay them. She looked at the water. I want to be the person who works for the people who can't. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, There are women in Philadelphia practicing law, informally through husbands' offices or under attorneys who'll have them. It's not common, but it exists. She looked at him. I know a man in Richmond, he said. Attorney named Caldwell. He's unconventional. He takes on cases no one else will. He's been looking for someone who understands county land records. He paused. I've been trying to think of how to mention this for 2 weeks without it sounding like I was trying to arrange your life for you. She held his gaze for a moment. It sounds like you found something useful, she said, and you're telling me about it. That's all it is, he said. Then thank you, she said. He nodded. He looked at the creek. He looked like a man who had been holding something carefully for 2 weeks and had just set it down and was relieved to have it out of his hands. The farm, she said. What happens to the farm is the first thing. I know that. I'm not... She stopped. I'm not 24 and dreaming. I know what the obligations are. I didn't say you were dreaming, he said. I asked what you wanted. She looked at him directly. Both things, she said. I want both things. The farm protected and the law work in whatever form that takes and whatever order it has to come in. She paused. Is that greedy? No, he said without hesitation. It's honest. She thought, he never makes her feel like wanting things is the wrong size. She filed that away in the notebook that was no longer a notebook, but a private accounting she kept in the quietest part of herself. Yeah. They were riding back toward the valley when the horse came. Not a casual approach, a hard ride. Someone pushing their animal the kind of pace that meant news. They both heard it at the same time and pulled up simultaneously. And around the bend in the trail came Thomas at a gallop on the farm's old draft horse, which was not a riding animal and was not happy about being asked to gallop. And Thomas's face was the specific color of a boy who has been frightened badly and has been riding fast to outrun the fright. Clara's heart dropped before he said a word. Thomas. She moved toward him. What happened? He pulled up. He was breathing hard. Papa, he said. He collapsed in the south field. About an hour ago. Mama sent me. She was already turning the mare. She heard Whitmore moving beside her. No questions, no delay. Just the immediate purposeful action of a man who understood that this was not the moment for words. She rode hard. Her father was in this parlor when she got there. He was conscious, which was the first thing she checked, and sitting in the chair by the window, which meant he had been moved from wherever he'd gone down in the field. Eleanor was beside him. Their neighbor Henry Pratt, who had been working the adjacent field, had helped carry him in. Clara was at her father's side before she'd fully stopped moving. Papa? I'm all right, George said, which was what he would say, regardless of the truth. You're not all right, she said. You don't collapse in the south field when you're all right. The heat. It's September, she said. Papa, look at me. He looked at her. His color was poor, not terrible, not the gray of something catastrophic, but the particular pallor of a man who has been pushing past what his body has been trying to tell him for some time. "How long?" she said. "Clara, how long has this been happening?" He looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at her daughter with the expression of a woman who has been managing information with surgical precision for as long as she can manage it, and who has just run out of road. "Since spring," Eleanor said quietly. Clara felt the floor shift slightly. "Spring," she repeated. "The doctor in Harrisonburg says it's his heart," Eleanor said. "She said it the way you say things that are real and difficult and have to be said in front of the person they're about. It's not critical, he says, not yet. But he needs to rest. He needs to stop doing the full labor of the farm." Clara looked at her father. George Bennett looked back at her with the expression of a man who has been found out, and who is both relieved and ashamed to be found, and who loves his daughter too much to hold the shame higher than the relief. "I didn't want to worry you," he said. "Papa," she said, and her voice came out quieter than she intended, with something in it she couldn't fully suppress. "You had enough to worry about," he said. "The boundary business and Harrington and—" "You are never something I worry about," she said. "You are someone I care for. Those are different things." He reached up and put his hand over hers, where it gripped the arm of his chair. From behind her, she heard the door. Whitmore, still there, who had ridden in behind her, and tied both horses and followed her inside, and was now standing in the entrance of the parlor with his hat in his hand and the specific expression of a man who is witnessing something private and is doing his best to be invisible inside it. "Mr. Bennett," he said. His voice was quiet. "I'm glad you're sitting up." George looked at him. Something moved across his face, recognition assessment, and something softer that she couldn't entirely name. "Whitmore," he said. "You were with her?" "Yes, sir." "Rode back fast?" "Yes, sir." George looked at their joined hands, his and Clara's, and then at Whitmore, and then back at his daughter. He said nothing for a moment. Then to Whitmore, in the plain direct voice he used for things that mattered, "Thank you for bringing her back safe." Whitmore nodded once. He looked at Clara. She gave a small nod. "I'm all right, go." And he withdrew to the kitchen doorway, which was close enough to be present and far enough to give them privacy. She stayed beside her father for a long time. Eleanor made tea, and Henry Pratt went home, and Thomas sat at the kitchen table with the slightly shattered expression of a 14-year-old who has had a very long morning. Whitmore sat across from him and said something quiet to him that Clara from the parlor couldn't hear, but she saw Thomas's shoulders come down slightly from where they'd been up around his ears, and she was grateful for whatever it was. When her father was settled and had agreed under moderate protest to stay in the chair until the doctor could be fetched from Harrisonburg, Clara came to the kitchen. Whitmore stood when she came in. He had the look of a man waiting to be told what was needed next. Which was what you wanted in a person in a moment like this. Not sympathy speeches, not the performance of concern, just readiness. "I need to get word to Dr. Haynes," she said. "I'll go," he said immediately. "It's 10 miles to Harrisonburg." "I know where it is," he said. She looked at him. "Clara?" His voice was steady. "Let me go." She nodded. He left within 5 minutes. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him ride out, and her mother came to stand beside her without touching her, and without speaking, and they stood together for a moment in the particular solidarity of two women who are managing everything and feeling everything simultaneously and not letting one show the other. "He's going to be all right," Eleanor said. "I know," Clara said. "I mean your father." "I know, Mama." Eleanor went back to the stove. Clara stood at the window a moment longer. Dr. Haynes arrived before noon. He was a quiet man, practical and kind, who had been the Bennett family's physician for 15 years. He examined George for 20 minutes, while Clara and Eleanor waited in the kitchen with Thomas, who had recovered enough of himself to eat 3 Johnny cakes and ask 11 questions that Clara answered with the patience of someone who needed to be useful, and this was how she could be. When Dr. Haynes came out, he sat at the kitchen table and spoke plainly, which she respected. The heart has been working too hard for too long, he said. It's not a death sentence, but it is a change. He cannot continue the full labor of the farm. Light work carefully managed, no heavy lifting, no long days in the summer heat. He looked at Clara and Eleanor in turn. He needs to give up the field work. The question is what that means for the farm's management. The question landed in the kitchen and sat there. Clara knew what it meant. Without George doing the full labor, the farm required either hired help, which they could afford for maybe one season, or a fundamental change in how it was run. Thomas was 14 and capable, but not yet a man's full labor. Clara did her share, but the farm had always depended on George's daily physical work. It was not a crisis. It was not the end of anything. But it was a door closing, and she felt the draft of it. Dr. Haynes left. Eleanor went in to sit with George. Thomas was sent to do afternoon chores. Clara sat at the kitchen table alone for the first time all day. She sat with her hands flat on the table and thought about what the farm needed, and what her father needed, and what the next season looked like, and all the calculations that had just shifted. She was good at this, at the practical reckoning of things. She had been doing it since she was 16. She was not afraid of it, but she was tired. Just for this one moment in the empty kitchen with the September light coming through the window, she was tired. She heard boots on the kitchen step. Whitmore came in quietly. He had a different quality to him now than he'd had in the morning, still composed, but with something looser in it, the composure of a man who has been riding 10 miles fast and is allowing himself to just be present rather than performing. He saw her face. He sat down across from her without asking. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she said, "He's been pushing through it since spring. All those mornings I thought he was just early in the field. He was trying to do twice the work before the heat came on because the heat was harder for him." "He was protecting you," Whitmore said. "He was protecting me," she agreed. "And I was out there arguing property law with county landowners and reading boundary records and—" "Clara." His voice was quiet but direct. "You did not cause this. I know that. Do you?" She looked at him. "I know it logically," she said. "The rest of me needs a few hours." He nodded. That was all just a nod, which was the right answer because it didn't try to fix what couldn't be fixed quickly. He just accepted what she said and sat with her in it. She found that she could breathe a little better. "The farm," she said. "We're going to need help. Hired labor for at least one season while Thomas grows into the work. I have some money saved, not much, and there's the East Field yield from this summer, which was good." She was thinking out loud now, and she didn't usually do that with anyone, but somehow she was doing it. "If I take on the record work for Caldwell, your attorney in Richmond, even informally, even part-time, it would bring in—" "Clara," he said. "I'm thinking. I know you are." He paused. "Will you let me think with you?" She looked at him. He met her gaze steadily. She thought. He did not say, "Let me fix it." He said, "Let me think with you." She thought, there is a difference. He knows there is a difference. "All right," she said. They thought together for an hour at the kitchen table with the afternoon light moving across the room, working through what the farm needed and what was available and what the options were. He knew more about hired labor costs than she did. He employed 40 men and knew what fair wages looked like. She knew the land and the yields and what the farm could carry. They went back and forth building the practical picture the way they'd built the boundary analysis on the eastern fence line. At the end of it, they had something that looked manageable. Not easy, not without sacrifice, but manageable. She looked at the paper where she'd been writing figures. He said, "I want to offer something." She looked at him. "Not charity," he said before she could speak. "Not a gift. I want to offer an arrangement." He held her gaze. "I need someone who understands county records not just for my own properties, but for the tenant families on my land. What Aldrich did to those families, I want someone to go through every record on every Bennett tenant property I hold, review everything, find what's wrong and fix it." He paused. "It's real work. I'll pay a real wage for it, and it can be done from here. You wouldn't have to leave your family." She looked at him. "I've been trying to figure out how to offer this for 3 weeks," he said, and the admission came out with the slight roughness of a man who does not usually admit to having figured things out over time. "Without it seeming like you were arranging my life," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "You're not arranging my life," she said. "You're offering work to someone qualified to do it on terms that suit you both." She paused. "I'll need to see the full file list before I agree." Something moved through his expression, the thing she had learned to recognize as his particular version of relief, which was very small and very controlled, but which was there. "I'll have them sent over Monday," he said. "Good," she said. They sat for a moment in the kitchen in the September afternoon, with the figures on the paper between them and the sound of George Bennett moving carefully in the next room and Thomas doing chores outside. Then Whitmore said, "Clara." He had been calling her that since the assembly. She had not told him to stop, which was its own kind of answer. "Yes," she said. He looked at the paper. He looked at his hands. He looked at her. "I didn't come today because of records," he said. "I know," she said. "I came because—" He stopped. She waited. He said, "I reckon I have been finding reasons to come here for 6 weeks. Good reasons, all of them. Real ones." He paused. "But they were also excuses. To be in a place I wanted to be." The kitchen was very quiet. "And where is that?" she said, and her voice was very steady, which cost her something. He looked at her across the table. "Wherever you are," he said. She looked back at him. She thought about the notebook entry, the first one he listens, and the second he learns, and the third one she had never written, but had been carrying for weeks, fully formed, waiting. "He sees me." Not the farmer's daughter with the land records. Not the woman who challenged him at dinner. Not the useful mind with county knowledge. Her. The whole of her, the tired her, and the fierce her, and the dreaming her, and the practical her that sat at kitchen tables working through harvest figures. He saw all of it, and he had kept coming back. She said, "I need to say something honestly." "All right," he said. "I'm not a woman who will be still," she said. "I'm not going to stop reading the records or having opinions that are inconvenient or standing up in county assemblies when something needs to be said. I'm going to want to practice law or something close to it in some form that doesn't exist yet for women in Virginia. I'm going to be difficult about land rights and other people's fairness for the rest of my life." She paused. "And I'm going to disagree with you. Regularly. And I'm going to be right about some of it." He held her gaze. "Good," he said. "I'm serious, Jonathan." His name. His first name said by her for the first time. She saw it register on him, small, controlled, but there. "So am I," he said. She looked at him. She thought about her grandfather's journal, the last page. "What I want for this land is that whoever comes after me knows it honestly and holds it without shame." She thought that was true of more than land. "Then we understand each other," she said. "I believe we do," he said. Outside, Thomas's footsteps crossed the yard. Inside, the parlor door opened, and her mother's voice said something soft to her father, and her father answered. The farm breathed around them, the old particular breath of a place where people had been working and living and holding things together for 30 years. Whitmore reached across the table and put his hand over hers, just for a moment, brief and warm and certain. And then he drew it back because there were forms to observe, and a father in the next room, and a family around them, and he knew that. But he had put his hand there, and she had not moved. She looked at the paper with the figures. "Monday," she said. "Send the files Monday." "Monday." He agreed. He stood. He picked up his hat. He went to the door of the parlor and said, "Mr. Bennett, I'm glad you're looking better. I'll see you Sunday if that suits." George Bennett from his chair said, "Sunday suits fine, Whitmore." Clara stayed at the kitchen table. She listened to his boots cross the floor, and the door open and close, and she listened to the bay horse move down the road, and she sat in the September kitchen with the figures in front of her, and a farm that needed managing, and a father who needed care, and a whole life that required every practical thing she had. And she was, for the first time in a long time, entirely certain about where she was standing. Not because a man had come along and made things easier. They were not easier. They were, in fact, more complicated than they had been in July, in every direction. But because she had spent 6 weeks being fully, completely herself, with all the inconvenient parts, and the difficult opinions, and the land records, and the county assembly confrontations, and someone had seen all of it and come back. Every time. That was not rescue. That was not arrangement. That was something else. She picked up the pen and added one more line to the figures. She thought, this is what it looks like when something is real. She wrote Sunday's date at the top of the page. And the September afternoon settled around the Bennett farmhouse, like it intended to stay for a while, which was, she thought, exactly right. Jonathan Whitmore came on Sunday. He came the Sunday after that, and the Sunday after that. It became, without any formal declaration, a fact of the Bennett household's week, the way the church bell was a fact, the way the market day was a fact. Sunday morning, the bay horse on the county road. Sunday afternoon, Whitmore at the kitchen table, or walking the property with George, who was allowed light walking, now careful and measured, which he did, with the quiet dignity of a man learning a new language late in life. Clara noticed that her father and Jonathan Whitmore got along in the specific way that two private men sometimes got along, not loudly, not with great demonstrations, but steadily. They talked about land and weather, and the county assembly decisions, and the price of corn, and underneath all of it, they were doing the thing that men did when they were deciding whether to trust each other, which was simply to keep showing up until the question answered itself. By the third Sunday, it had answered itself. The Whitmore tenant file review took 6 weeks. Clara worked through it methodically, record by record the same way she had worked through the Bennett boundary question, oldest documents first, then forward building the complete picture before she touched a conclusion. She found 4 additional discrepancies beyond the ones Whitmore already knew about. 2 were minor and easily corrected. 1 was significant enough to require a county clerk filing and a compensation arrangement with the Hendricks family, who had been farming a parcel 12 feet narrower than their deed stated since 1807. 1 was when she traced it to its origin, not Aldrich's doing it all. She sat with that one for a day before she told him. She told him on a Tuesday at the kitchen table, with the file open in front of them. The Calder parcel, she said. The discrepancy there goes back to 1799, before Aldrich. He looked at the document she had set in front of him. That's your father's signature, she said quietly. Not on a falsification. He didn't falsify anything. But he accepted a survey he should have questioned. And the Calder family has been short 16 feet on their north line for 15 years. Whitmore looked at the document for a long time. She didn't say anything. She let him look. He was a good man, he said finally. Not defensively. Just a statement of something he believed, and was holding at the same time as something that contradicted it. I know, she said. Good men make errors. That's why records exist. She paused. What matters is what you do when you find it. He looked at her. The Calders, he said. James Calder is still on the property. His wife and son. James died 2 winters ago. I'll speak with them this week. He closed the file. He kept his hand on the cover for a moment. My father built this operation on the belief that a man's word was the same as his record. That if you said something was, so it was so. He paused. I've spent the last 3 months discovering that belief doesn't survive contact with actual records. It's a good belief, Clara said. It just needs a backup system. He looked at her. That's what records are, she said. The backup system for when good men still make errors. He picked up the file. He held her gaze for a moment with the expression she had come to know best, the one that was not his public face, or his landowner face, or his county assembly face, but the particular face he had when he was thinking something he was about to say. You should have been a lawyer 20 years ago, he said. Women didn't become lawyers 20 years ago, she said. They should have, he said, and the 2 words were so direct and so without qualification that she looked away for a moment at the window, because she was not quite ready to let him see what that did to her. Harrington made one more move in October. She had been expecting it. He was, as she had told Whitmore in September, patient and systematic, and a man like that did not accept a public setback in a county assembly and simply recalibrate quietly. He waited. He gathered. He prepared a second approach that was more careful than the first. What she had not expected was that he would approach her father directly. George told her about it on a Thursday evening in the barn while she was helping him with the light work he was now permitted. He told it plainly. Harrington had come Monday when Clara was in Harrisonburg at the clerk's office. He had sat at the kitchen table and had coffee with Eleanor and George, and he had made a different offer this time. Not for the eastern section alone. For the whole farm. Clara set down what she was holding. "He made it sound generous," George said. He was watching his daughter's face with the careful attention of a man who loves someone and is not sure how they will take what they're being told. "Good price. He said the farm would be well managed, that we could stay on in some capacity, that Thomas's future would be... Papa." Her voice was very quiet. "What did you say?" George looked at his hands. "I told him I needed to think about it." The barn was very still. "I'm telling you now," he said, "because I should have told you then. Because it's not just my decision, and it never has been, and I have been..." He stopped. "I have been making decisions about this land as though it is mine alone to make, and it isn't, and I know that, and I am sorry." She looked at her father. She thought about what he'd said at that dinner table 3 months ago. "I handled it," and about all the ways he had been trying to protect her by keeping her outside the room where the real decisions happened, and about the fact that he was telling her now, which was not a small thing. "The answer is no," she said. "I know," he said. "We are not selling this farm. Clara, we are not selling it," she said, and her voice was steady with the particular steadiness of a thing that has been decided at a level below argument. "Not to Harrington, not to anyone. This is grandfather's land and your land, and it's going to be Thomas's land, and that is not changing." She picked up what she'd set down. "I'll speak to Harrington myself." George was quiet for a moment. "He won't listen to you," he said carefully. "He doesn't have to listen," she said. "He just has to understand." "Going," she wrote to Whitmore that evening. Not to ask for help, she was precise about that in how she framed the letter. She wrote to inform him, because they had reached the point in whatever this was between them where informing each other of significant developments was simply what they did. She laid out the offer Harrington had made, the terms, the timing, and her intention to respond to it herself. She also wrote at the end, "I want to be clear that I am not asking you to intervene. I am handling this. But I thought you should know because he will likely approach you next, and I'd rather you heard the account from me first." The reply came the next morning. 4 sentences. "I understand. I will not intervene unless you ask me to. Harrington came to Whitmore Hall this morning before your letter arrived. I told him the Bennett farm was not available, and that any further approach to your family would be considered a trespass on a business relationship I consider concluded." She read the last sentence twice. He had not waited for her to tell him. He had already known, because Harrington had gone to him first, trying to build a coalition, or to gauge where Whitmore's loyalty actually sat. And Whitmore had answered him before she had even sent her letter. She folded the note and thought, he didn't do it for me. He did it because it was right. Then she went to find Harrington. She found him at the feed store in town, which was where she had calculated he would be on a Friday morning, because Charles Harrington was a man of regular habits, and she had been paying attention for 3 months. He saw her come in and did the quick, controlled thing his face always did. Then he nodded to the man he was speaking with and moved toward her, and she moved to meet him in the middle of the store, and they stood in the ordinary Friday morning noise of a place where people were buying things and going about their lives. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Mr. Harrington," she said. "I'll be brief." He waited. "The Bennett farm is not for sale," she said. "It was not for sale in 1812 when you asked my father, or in the spring when you asked him again, or on Monday when you asked him a 3rd time." She held his gaze. It will not be for sale next year or the year after. Not because we don't have difficulties, we do, and you know we do because you have been watching for them, but because difficulties are not the same as surrender, and I want you to understand that distinction clearly. Harrington studied her. Clara. Miss Bennet, she said. He paused. I'm also going to ask you something, she said, and I want you to take it seriously. She waited a beat. Stop. Not because you're losing, though you are. Stop because it's the right thing. This county has a long memory, Mr. Harrington. The people in it know what patience that goes in one direction for 3 years usually means. She paused. You have a good reputation. You've built it carefully. I'd hate to see what you do with it over one piece of land. He looked at her for a long moment. She did not look away. You're remarkable, he said finally, and there was something in it that was not entirely ungenerous, a reluctant, real admission from a man who had underestimated her badly and had finally stopped pretending he hadn't. I'm a farmer's daughter, with land records and a long memory, she said. But thank you. She nodded once. Good morning, Mr. Harrington. She walked out of the feed store into the October morning. Her hands were steady. Bond, the twist she had not seen coming, arrived on a cold November morning in a letter from the county clerk's office, not Alderton. His predecessor's records, a batch of older filings that had been found during a storage reorganization misfiled in 1809 when the office moved to its current location. John Alderton sent them to Clara directly with a note that said, "Thought you'd want to see these before anyone else. Some Bennet family business in here." She opened the file at the kitchen table. The first document was a recording error from 1801 minor already superseded. The second was a drainage note she'd already seen a version of. The third stopped her cold. It was a deed transfer, dated 1799, signed by her grandfather, Elias Bennet, and witnessed by 2 men she didn't recognize. It was a transfer of 22 acres, not the 40 her grandfather had lost to the boundary error she already knew about. A different 22 acres. The southern parcel bordering the creek which had been in Bennet hands, or what the family believed was Bennet hands ever since. The transfer was to a man named William Calder. She sat very still. The Calders, the same family whose north parcel line had been short 16 feet since 1799. The same Calders who were Whitmore tenants. The same family whose parcel discrepancy she had found in the Whitmore records and brought to Jonathan's attention 3 weeks ago. She read the transfer document 3 times. Then she read it a 4th time more slowly, looking for what she had missed. She found it on the 4th read. The transfer was conditional. Her grandfather had transferred the 22 acres to William Calder on a repayment condition, effectively a mortgage using land as collateral. If the Calders repaid the specified sum by December 1801, the land returned to Bennet ownership. If not, the transfer was permanent. There was no repayment record in the file. There was also no record of the permanent transfer ever being finalized with the county clerk, which meant that 22 acres of land that the Bennet family did not know they had a claim to, and that the Calder family did not know they might not own cleanly, had been sitting in legal ambiguity for 15 years. She put the document down. She sat with it for a full hour. This was not simple. This was not a marker stone moved 6 feet south or a transposed reference parcel. This was a conditional deed from her grandfather's hand that could be read 2 ways, and depending on how it was read, it either gave the Bennet family a legitimate claim to 22 additional acres, or it gave the Calder family, specifically Margaret Calder, the widow and her son, a cloud on their title that could make their land difficult to sell or pass down. She thought about Margaret Calder. She had met her once at a church social 2 years back. A quiet woman in her 50s, steady-eyed and practical, who had been farming that land with her late husband for 20 years and was now farming it with her son. A woman who had been dealing without knowing it with the 16-foot north line discrepancy that Whitmore's man Aldrich had created. A woman who had been carrying a weight she didn't know about and had just had part of it lifted. Clara was not going to add another weight. She made the decision before she had consciously finished thinking it through, which was unusual for her. She was typically a person who thought before she decided. But this decision came from a place below thinking, from the same place where she had told her father, "We are not selling this farm," from the part of her that knew what was right before her mind finished making the argument. She was not going to pursue the conditional transfer. She was going to seal the file document for the family records, so there was no future uncertainty, and go to the county clerk to ensure the Calder title was cleared cleanly. Whatever her grandfather had intended with that transfer in 1799, and she thought she knew. She thought it was a neighborly arrangement between two men who trusted each other and expected it to resolve itself. It had not been intended as a weapon for his grandchildren to use, 15 years later, against a widow farmer. She picked up the pen. She wrote the documentation clearly and completely. The conditional deed, the absence of repayment. Record her family's decision not to pursue the claim, the recommended county action to clear the Calder title permanently. Then she wrote a separate letter to Jonathan Whitmore, because the Calders were his tenants, because he needed to know, because they had reached the point she accepted this fully now, on a cold November morning, at the kitchen table, where she told him the things that mattered. He came that afternoon, not Sunday. A Tuesday afternoon, and the fact that he had rearranged his week to come on a Tuesday told her something, and the expression on his face when she opened the door told her something more. He read the conditional deed at the kitchen table. He read her documentation. He read the letter she had written for the county clerk. When he finished, he looked up at her. "You're giving it up," he said. "I'm not giving up anything," she said. "It was never mine to take." Clara, a conditional deed from 1799 without a repayment record could be argued. "I know what it could be argued," she said. "I'm not interested in what it could be argued. I'm interested in what's right." He looked at her. "The Calders have been farming that land for 20 years, she said. "Margaret Calder is a widow trying to pass something down to her son. My grandfather and her father-in-law had an arrangement between neighbors that was never meant to be a legal landmine for their families to step on 15 years later." She paused. "My grandfather wrote in his journal that he wanted whoever came after him to hold this land without shame. I intend to honor that. And I can't hold anything without shame if I use a procedural gap to take something from a widow who doesn't even know the gap exists." The kitchen was very quiet. Whitmore set the documents down. He looked at her for a long moment, the complete unguarded look he had, the one she had stopped trying to decode, and had simply started receiving. "I have met a great many people in my life," he said. "Lawyers, men of business, people who knew the law the way you know it." He paused. "I have never met anyone who knew what the law was for the way you do." She looked at the table. "Look at me," he said. She looked at him. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to hear it clearly. Not as an arrangement, not as a business matter." He held her gaze. "As what it is." Her hands were flat on the table. "Will you marry me?" he said. The kitchen was absolutely still. She heard her father shift in the parlor. She heard the November wind at the window. She heard the farm breathe around them, the way it always breathed, steady and old, and entirely indifferent to the human moments that happened inside it. She looked at Jonathan Whitmore across the kitchen table in the house where she had been born, on the land her grandfather had built from $40 and a mule, and the particular stubbornness of a man who had decided things were going to be all right. "You know what you're taking on," she said. "Yes," he said. "I mean specifically," she said. "I'm going to practice law, not informally, not as a secondary thing. I intend to find a way to practice it properly, and it is going to be difficult, and it is going to make people uncomfortable, and there will be county assemblies where I stand up and say things that reflect on your name." "Good," he said. "I disagree with powerful people for a living." "I know," he said. "I'm one of them." Something moved through her, not quite a smile, but close. "I will never simply agree with you," she said. "Clara." His voice was very steady. "That is not something I am asking you to give up. That is something I am asking you to keep." He paused. "I did not stay in this valley because of the eastern boundary. I did not spend 3 months coming to this kitchen because of county records. He held her gaze. I stayed because of you, exactly as you are. And I would like if you're willing to spend a great deal more time in that condition. She looked at him. She thought about 6 months ago, before any of this. Before the carriage on the county road and the dinner table and the words, Mr. Whitmore, you are mistaken. She had been exactly the same person she was now, but she had been that person in a room without many windows. And then someone had come in and not asked her to be smaller or quieter or more convenient, and the windows had turned out to have been there all along. Yes, she said. It was the same word she'd said in the September kitchen when her mother asked if she would go riding. Simple and direct, and completely without qualification. His exhale was very quiet, but she heard it. They were married in December. Not the grand Whitmore Hall ceremony that the county had been speculating about since September, a small church wedding, the Methodist church on the county road where the Bennetts had worshipped for 30 years. 40 people. Her father walked her down the aisle slowly with care, and he held her hand a beat longer than necessary at the end, before he gave it to the man waiting at the front. Jonathan Whitmore, standing in the plain church in his dark coat, watched her walk toward him with the expression he had when he was allowing himself to feel something without managing it. She had only seen that expression a few times. She was glad it was visible now in front of 40 witnesses. She was glad it was on record. The ceremony was simple. When it was done, Martha Alderton cried. Thomas did not cry, but stood very straight in the way of a boy trying to be a man about something. Eleanor Bennett stood beside George with her hand in his arm, and her face composed in the way Eleanor's face was always composed, but her eyes were bright, and Clara saw it. Harrington was not there. He had sent a brief civil note of congratulations to George Bennett. It was the last communication the Bennett family received from him for quite some time. Miss Hogue. The county had opinions about the marriage. Of course it did. The county always had opinions, and this one, the wealthiest landowner in Rockingham, marrying a farmer's daughter with no dowry and no social position, and the specific reputation of a woman who stood up in assemblies and corrected powerful men, was the kind of opinion the county would be having for years. Clara knew this. She had expected it. She had made peace with it before the wedding on a morning in November, when she had sat down and written out in the clear, precise sentences she used for things that mattered every concern she had about what the marriage would mean for her work and her standing and her freedom to be herself. She had read the list. She had sat with it for an hour. Then she had turned the paper over and written on the back one sentence. He has never once asked me to be less. She had put that paper in the parlor desk next to the land deed and the 1797 survey and the notebook with the entries in the margin. It was still there. The twist the county did not see coming arrived in March. Attorney Caldwell and Richmond Whitmore's unconventional lawyer, the one who took cases no one else would, wrote to Clara in February with a proposal. He had 2 pending land cases for families who had come to him without resources to pay, both involving boundary disputes with fraudulent elements, both requiring someone with deep knowledge of county records and the patience to build a complete evidentiary picture. He wanted to know if she would take them on. Not as a lawyer of record, he was honest about the limits of what the law currently permitted, but as what he called a records advocate. She would build the full documentary case. He would present it. The families would have representation they could not otherwise afford. She would be paid from the fee he would waive from the opposing party if they won. He added in the last paragraph, I want to be direct, Mrs. Whitmore. I am not offering this because of your husband's recommendation. Though I have his endorsement, I am offering it because the work you did on the Bennett-Whitmore boundary question is the most thorough county records analysis I have seen in 15 years of practice. If you are willing, I have more cases than I can handle and none of the resources you carry. She read the letter at breakfast. Jonathan looked at her face when she put it down. Well, he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the steady, open expression she had fallen in love with, somewhere between the east field and the kitchen table, and 40 witnesses in a Methodist church. He wants me to take 2 cases, she said. I know, Jonathan said. He wrote to me as well. Professional courtesy. He paused. He didn't ask my permission. He asked my opinion. And what was your opinion? That you would know within 10 minutes of reading the letter whether you wanted to do it, he said. And that my opinion on the matter was beside the point. She held his gaze. She thought about her grandfather's 40 acres. She thought about Margaret Calder, whose title was now clear, who had received a letter in January explaining the conditional deed and the Bennett family's decision not to pursue it, and who had come to the farm in February with her son and stood at the kitchen door with the expression of a woman who has been carrying something she didn't know she was carrying and has just been allowed to put it down. She thought about the two families in Richmond who had come to Caldwell without resources, with boundary disputes and fraudulent documents, with the same need her grandfather had had in 1798, the need for someone to know where to look. She thought about what she had told Jonathan on the day he proposed. I intend to find a way to practice it properly. Yes, she said. She was aware that she had now said that word to him a significant number of times, and that it had meant something different, and also exactly the same thing every single time. He picked up his coffee. I'll tell my lawyer to expect correspondence from you, he said. She picked up her pen. She took the first case in March and won it in June. The second case took longer 9 months, a county hearing 3 rounds of documentary review, but the record was clear and clear. Records had a particular power when assembled by someone who understood what they meant and could explain them to a judge in complete, simple sentences. She won that one too. By the following year, Caldwell had sent her 4 more cases. By the year after that, she had a correspondence with 2 other attorneys in Virginia and one in Pennsylvania who had heard through the particular word of mouth of people who deal in difficult land cases about a woman in Rockingham County who could find what no one else could find in a county records file and build a case that held. Jonathan built her a proper office in the east wing of Whitmore Hall. Her own room, her own shelves, her own desk. Not a shared space or a parlor corner, but a room with a door and a window, and the complete Bennett family land records transferred from the parlor desk to proper filing cases. He did not make a speech about it. He opened the door, handed her the key, and said, "It's yours. Do what you need with it." She had stood in the doorway of that room for a long moment. Then she had gone inside and started arranging the files. George Bennett lived for 7 more years. He did not do heavy field work again, but he walked the farm every morning and sat with Thomas in the evenings and taught his son everything he knew in the quiet, patient way of a man who has learned that teaching is more important than doing. He sat in his chair by the parlor window on Sundays when Jonathan came, and the 2 men talked about land and weather, and the county and the plain. Comfortable way they had developed. And when George Bennett died in the spring of 1821 on a Tuesday morning with Eleanor beside him, and the Virginia fields going green outside the window, Jonathan Whitmore was one of the 4 men who carried his coffin to the churchyard. Clara stood at the grave with her hand in Jonathan's, and felt the full weight of it, her grandfather's voice, and her father's hands, and 30 years of Shenandoah Valley soil, and everything that had been built on it, and everything that had been saved. She did not cry until they were home. Jonathan sat beside her at the kitchen table, and did not say anything, and did not leave. And when she was done, he handed her a glass of water, and she drank it, and they sat together in the old kitchen, in the silence that is only possible between people who have been through enough that silence has become a form of fluency. "He knew," she said finally. "I know," Jonathan said. "About us. From the beginning. He knew before I did." "I suspect he did," Jonathan said, and something in his voice was warm and rueful and very honest. She looked at her water glass. "He said to me once," she said, "that Whitmore came because of the records but stayed for something else." She paused. "I told him he was wrong. He said, 'Daughter, I may not know land law, but I know people.'" Jonathan's mouth curved very slightly. "He was right," Clara said. "He was right," Jonathan agreed. She looked at him. She thought 6 years since the dinner table. 6 years since the words, "Mr. Whitmore, you are mistaken," went into the air of the Bennett farmhouse and changed the direction of two lives that had been moving until that moment on perfectly separate tracks. 6 years of boundary corrections and county assemblies and November kitchen proposals and Richmond land cases, and a room of her own with a door and a key. 6 years of a man who came back, every time. Not because she was convenient or compliant or easy to love. She was none of those things, and she knew it. But because she was exactly herself, and he had decided somewhere between the East Field and the apple cake and the 40 witnesses in a Methodist church, that exactly herself was what he wanted. She reached across the kitchen table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand and held hers. Outside, the Virginia spring was doing what it always did. Coming back without asking permission, filling the fields with green that had not been there last week, insisting on itself. The creek ran along the eastern boundary. The right boundary now clean and clear. The boundary her grandfather had believed in, and her father had worked, and she had fought for, and a man she had once told he was wrong, had finally confirmed in county record. Patience Run, her grandfather had named it. She had always thought that was about endurance, about waiting things out. She understood now that she had been partly wrong. Patience was not just waiting. It was the willingness to stay present while things became what they were meant to be, to hold steady through the time between what you started with and what you were building toward, and to trust that the work was worth it, even when you couldn't yet see the finished shape. She looked at Jonathan. She thought I told a powerful man he was wrong at my father's dinner table, and he came back to learn from me, and I taught him what I knew, and he showed me who he was, and we built something honest out of all of it. Out of county records and marker stones, and a county assembly confrontation, and 2 words written in a notebook margin that turned out to be the beginning of the longest conversation of my life. She thought my grandfather would have approved of every bit of it. She thought the land is safe, and my father is at rest, and the work is real, and I am exactly myself. She thought this is what it looks like when something is built right. She squeezed Jonathan's hand. He squeezed back. And in Rockingham County, Virginia, in the spring of 1821, that was enough, more than enough. It was everything a life built honestly and held without shame was always meant to be.